Beneath the velvet robes and golden crowns lies something far less polished. Whispered scandals, secret vices, and centuries of royal behavior so appalling, even the tabloids couldn't make it up. These aren't myths. They're the rumors they tried to hide, until they were proven true. From exploding coffins to pre-squeezed toothpaste, this is monarchy at its most unhinged. Welcome to 53 disgusting royal rumors that turned out to be true. A descent into the weird, the entitled, and the disturbingly well-documented. And yes, someone really did boil 7 eggs to get one just right. Before we crack open the first royal disgrace, make sure you hit subscribe. It helps this strange little corner of YouTube stay alive. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it over there right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? We want to know who else is up late unraveling royal madness. 1. Henry VIII's exploding coffin. Fluid rumor. The English don't bury kings. They entomb their problems in stone crypts, wrap them in velvet, and hope history forgets the stench. But Henry VIII had other ideas. When the bloated corpse of the most infamous monarch in English history began leaking black, noxious fluids in the middle of St. George's Chapel, it was less a burial and more a posthumous confession. The rumor went that his coffin quite literally burst open, fluid oozing out, dripping onto the chapel floor. For centuries it was whispered in pubs and Protestant sermons. Divine punishment. A king who shattered churches, butchered wives, and devoured power, now rupturing like overripe fruit. Except, it wasn't just symbolism, it was fact. Chapel records from 1547 confirm that Henry's coffin was so poorly sealed and his body so distended with rot that it cracked. A dog was even said to have lapped up the spilled liquid, though that detail, it seems, was metaphorically borrowed from a parable about tyrants, which frankly only makes it more English. At the time, courtiers rushed to deny it. Of course they did. The Tudors had image management down to an art form. After all, this was the same dynasty that weaponized portraits and edited their own histories while still alive. But the accounts from St. George's persisted. Eyewitnesses noted a foul stench, a black puddle, a coffin swollen and groaning as if it still held grudges. In the moral economy of royal storytelling, Henry's leaking corpse was karmic accounting. He died massive, ulcerated, paranoid, and excommunicated. His remains simply followed suit. Today, historians shrug. Yes, the coffin leaked. Yes, it's true. No, it probably wasn't divine punishment, just 16th century embalming failure and a body pumped with too many rich meats and self-righteousness. But it makes you wonder, what happens when your legacy is too toxic to contain, even in death? And if Henry's body could rupture under the weight of his sins, what else was he rotting from the inside out? 2. Henry VIII's foul-smelling leg ulcers. Long before Henry VIII exploded in his coffin, he was quietly decaying from the legs up. In hushed tones and gagging whispers, courtiers gossiped about the king's legs, not in admiration. In revulsion, he reeked. Behind the silks and gold-threaded hose, the King of England was harboring suppurating, ulcerous craters on both legs, wounds that never closed, festered in the open air, and stank like a battlefield grave in July. The rumor was everywhere. Ambassadors hinted at it in letters. Foreign dignitaries recoiled from the smell. But the official court position? Utter denial. The king was healthy, virile, a lion in winter. Meanwhile, his physicians were packing his wounds with herbs, vinegar, and desperate prayers. It wasn't just a medical issue, it was a metaphor in motion. Henry, once the golden boy of Christendom, had turned into a bloated tyrant who couldn't walk without pain or rage. The leg ulcers were thought to be the result of a jousting accident in 1536, when the king was thrown from his horse and the royal thighs took the brunt. The wound became chronic. The ulcers became his private hell. And yet, his anger only sharpened. What followed was a slow-motion biological coup. Henry couldn't hunt, couldn't dance, and soon couldn't sire more heirs. His moods blackened with his wounds. He lashed out at wives, advisors, sons. His temper was legendary, but it had a scent, and it followed him into every room. When the rumors reached the common folk, they weren't horrified. They were vindicated. The tyrant was decaying alive. God was at work. But even divine irony smells terrible. Modern medical historians now confirm the ulcers were very real, very severe, and likely played a major role in his mental and emotional deterioration. Chronic infection, poor circulation, possibly diabetes, definitely karma. And what does it say about a king when even his legs rebelled? If the king's power was absolute but his body was a slow-motion collapse, what else was falling apart, quietly, stinkily, under the velvet robes? If you've made it this far into royal egg science and valet-assisted dental care, you clearly belong here. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. This rabbit hole only gets weirder. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it on your end right now? Is it sunrise in Sydney or midnight in Manchester? We're building a worldwide circle of the royally bewildered. 3. Charles II, keeping hundreds of mistresses. Officially, Charles II was known as the Merry Monarch. Unofficially, he was the monarchy's most prolific horizontal diplomat. The rumors started almost immediately after his restoration to the throne in 1660. Wherever Charles went, so did beautiful women. And not just courtiers or noble ladies. Actresses, dancers, sometimes married women's sisters. There were whispers that he kept not one, not two, but dozens of mistresses at a time, and that they weren't just secret flings, they were salaried positions. At court, it was called gallantry. In the broadsheets, it was called fornication. In reality, it was a royal HR nightmare. The rumors were so persistent that even foreign ambassadors began tracking his liaisons like military movements. The French have moved into Whitehall didn't refer to troops. It meant Charles was sleeping with a new envoy's wife. Turns out the rumors were entirely true. Diaries, letters, and ambassadorial reports confirm Charles had scores of mistresses throughout his reign. Some scholars put the number well into the hundreds. The most famous include Barbara Palmer, whom he made a duchess, Nell Gwynn, an actress who once sold oranges, and Louise de Kerouaille, a French agent/lover. But these weren't just romantic entanglements. These were political alliances. Mistresses came with influence, pensions, estates. They were power brokers in silk gowns. And Charles? He was the CEO of Bedroom Diplomacy, Inc. Why did he do it? Some say revenge against Puritanism. Some say pure libido. Others think Charles, exiled for years, simply vowed never to be bored again. Even his court, usually tight-lipped, joked about it. When someone asked how he found time to govern, a courtier reportedly replied, "He delegates the state, but not the bedchamber." Modern historians don't dispute any of it. In fact, many believe we underestimate the number of Charles's affairs. He acknowledged at least 14 illegitimate children, and that's just the start. No wonder he died of apoplexy. He'd been running an empire in the daytime and a soap opera at night. But beneath the merriment was something darker. Charles's mistresses wielded enormous influence. They sold access, brokered favors, and shaped policy. The monarchy became a bedroom bureaucracy. And it raises the real question, who was actually ruling England? Because if the king was busy in bed, who was in the war room? 4. Charles II, bribing women to keep quiet. Charles II didn't just leave a trail of perfume and broken hearts, he left receipts. While the Restoration Court gossiped freely about the king's constant romantic entanglements, there was another rumor that floated through the velvet-curtained halls of Whitehall, that Charles was paying women to keep their mouths shut. Literally. Mistresses, actresses, and the occasional scandal-prone noblewoman were said to receive not just jewelry and housing, but cold, hard cash. Not always for affection, but for discretion. At the time, it sounded too transactional for the so-called Merry Monarch. Surely Charles, the king who turned flirtation into foreign policy, didn't need to bribe lovers into silence. Surely he was above that. Except he wasn't. Treasury records later revealed that Charles routinely dipped into the privy purse, and sometimes state funds, to keep his liaisons from becoming liabilities. Court papers and ambassadorial letters document a series of gifts, pensions, and settlements given to women after they had served their purpose, politically or otherwise. These weren't romantic tokens. These were exit packages. Barbara Palmer, for example, received a townhouse and a title. Nell Gwynn got a mansion and her son's noble rank. Louise de Querouaille, the French mistress, received jewels so valuable they caused a diplomatic incident. Even lesser-known names, women whose only sin was having shared too much information over wine, ended up with estates, hush payments, or mysteriously well-off brothers. The line between mistress and state liability blurred quickly. The gossip mongers of the time speculated that Charles spent more on personal damage control than on naval defense. And honestly, they weren't far off. Why all the secrecy? Because Charles wasn't just sleeping with women. He was sleeping with political agents, married courtiers' wives, and individuals whose mere presence could ignite scandal. In an era when kings ruled by image as much as sword, a careless whisper could destabilize alliances. Or worse, make the king look foolish. And Charles hated looking foolish. Modern historians now view these payments as a calculated form of risk management. Charles was savvy. He didn't trust anyone completely, especially not those who knew what he looked like without his wig. In bribing his lovers, he wasn't being cowardly. He was being strategic. Discretion bought time. Silence bought survival. It's ironic. For a man known for laughing, drinking, and merrymaking, Charles's most intimate dealings were run like a covert operation. One could argue he created Britain's first informal intelligence service, staffed entirely by ex-lovers and compensated in pearls. But the truth always leaks, eventually. And if secrets require constant payment to stay buried, what happens when the purse runs out? 5. Edward II's humiliating favorites, dominating him. To the medieval English nobility, nothing was more terrifying than a weak king, except maybe a king who loved the wrong people in the wrong way. During Edward II's reign, barons whispered about his favorites, a polite word for men like Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer, whose relationship with the king went far beyond politics. What began as gossip among nobles quickly spiraled into a court-wide panic that Edward was handing over the reins of power not to trusted advisors, but to sycophants who manipulated him like a marionette. And not just politically. The rumors were cruel, pointed, and, in classic English fashion, coded. Chronicles described Gaveston as excessively familiar with the king, while others hinted at undue influence and private entertainments. Barons were not amused, especially not when they saw their lands being confiscated and their authority overridden by men they considered social inferiors. Eventually, they stopped whispering. Parliament records show that Edward was repeatedly warned, formally, about the dangerous intimacy of his relationships. Gaveston was exiled, then recalled, then executed by a group of lords who'd had enough. Enter Hugh Despencer, who filled the vacuum with even more aggression and arguably more control over Edward than his predecessor ever had. So were the rumors true? Unequivocally, yes. Letters, chronicles, and official records confirm that both Gaveston and Despencer held unprecedented sway over the king. They controlled patronage, manipulated royal decisions, and extracted vast lands and titles for themselves. They were, to use the 14th century phrase, running the kingdom, as if they themselves wore the crown. The humiliation wasn't just political. Edward's credibility crumbled. His dependence on his favorites, emotionally, financially, and militarily, made him look weak. Worse, submissive. In a feudal world obsessed with dominance and masculinity, Edward's favoritism wasn't just controversial. It was treasonous to the image of kingship itself. Eventually, Edward paid the price. His wife, Isabella of France, led a coup with her lover, Roger Mortimer. Edward was deposed, imprisoned, and later died under mysterious and, some claim, disturbingly symbolic circumstances. The chroniclers didn't hold back. Neither did the Rumours. But the power dynamics were clear. Edward II's reign ended not with a bang, but with the collapse of a king utterly controlled by those who knew how to wield his affection like a weapon. Modern historians acknowledge that Edward was not just politically isolated but emotionally dependent. Dangerously so. His trust in Gaveston and Despenser wasn't merely about companionship, it was abdication. And in a monarchy, abdication of judgment is often more lethal than abdication of the throne, which leads to the next royal who took indulgence one step further into the bath. 6. Mary, Queen of Scots. Bathing in wine Scotland is famously cold, wet, and suspicious of anything French. So when Mary, Queen of Scots, returned from France and began importing barrels of wine for her personal hygiene, the whispers were immediate. They said she bathed in it, soaked in it, marinated like venison in a Bordeaux reduction. At first it sounded like anti-Catholic propaganda, or an early form of tabloid body shaming. The spoiled French-raised queen dunking herself in drink while her subjects froze in drafty keeps. After all, what kind of monarch uses claret as skincare? Apparently, a historically accurate one. Letters from Mary's household confirm that she regularly ordered wine, specifically white wine, not just for drinking, but for preparations of the skin. Wine was believed to have medicinal and beautifying properties. It tightened pores, brightened complexion, and masked unpleasant odors. In the 16th century, this wasn't considered luxurious. It was considered intelligent, if you could afford it. Of course, in Protestant Scotland, even intelligence could look sinful if it had too much sparkle. The wine-bathing rumors took on a moral weight. She was frivolous, vain, foreign, an alien queen soaking in imported decadence while her people dealt with religious upheaval, famine, and the occasional English invasion. Wine baths became a symbol, not of skincare, but of disconnect. By the time Mary was imprisoned and later executed, the rumor had calcified into a character flaw. History painted her not as a shrewd monarch using Renaissance skincare, but as a foolish woman drunk on vanity. And her literal wine baths became metaphorical. Modern historians, however, see it differently. The wine was real. The bathing was real. But so was the propaganda. What Mary saw as health, others saw as hedonism. What she experienced as cleanliness, her enemies labeled corruption. As always, the bathwater gets political. And so, Mary became the monarch who tried to wash herself clean of sin in a substance that made her look even more stained. Which makes you wonder, when your enemies can turn your hygiene routine into heresy, what's the next boundary to be crossed? Perhaps it's when a king no longer hides who he kisses. 7. James why kissing male courtiers publicly. In a royal court obsessed with protocol, distance, and carefully staged intimacy, James had a habit that sent shockwaves through the velvet-draped halls of England and Scotland. He kissed men, not metaphorically, not diplomatically, physically, on the lips, in public. The court gossips didn't have to dig far. The king himself made the rumors easy. He doted on his male favorites with open displays of affection, embracing, stroking their faces, and yes, kissing them in full view of foreign ambassadors, bishops, and anyone else who happened to be watching uncomfortably from behind a tapestry. In an age where men might greet with a formal peck on the cheek as a sign of status or brotherhood, James's affections weren't seen as traditional courtesy. They were different, intimate, charged. The line between kingly patronage and personal infatuation blurred, and then vanished entirely. Observers began to talk. Then they began to write. One ambassador from Venice described the king's affections toward his favorite, the Duke of Buckingham, as more than love. Sir Anthony Weldon, a disgruntled courtier, later wrote that James leaned on Buckingham leaner than a man should on his wife. Even the Archbishop reportedly raised an eyebrow, though in that era, that counted as open rebellion. Was it scandalous? Of course. Was it new? Not quite. James had shown the same affectionate tendencies earlier in Scotland with Esme Stuart, a handsome French nobleman who arrived at court and quickly became the king's shadow. Their relationship was so intense that the Scottish nobility eventually exiled Stuart. James wept publicly. Historians now confirm that James's affection for his male favorites wasn't merely political. It was personal. Though we can't project modern identities onto early modern monarchs, it's clear James's expressions of love were genuine, unfiltered, and to many of his contemporaries deeply confusing. But perhaps the real scandal wasn't the kissing. It was the power that came with it. Favorites like Buckingham rose meteorically, receiving titles, estates, and influence far beyond their experience. Court factions grew bitter. Nobles schemed. Political decisions began to look less like policy and more like pillow talk. And that, more than the kissing, was what truly unsettled the establishment. In the end, James didn't care. He once declared that he loved the Duke of Buckingham more than any man, adding, "Christ had his John and I have mine." A declaration of affection disguised as scripture, perfectly royal, perfectly evasive. And while historians today tread carefully around the labels, the evidence remains. The rumors were true. James did kiss his male courtiers in public. He did favor them outrageously, and he made sure everyone knew it. Because what's more powerful than ruling a kingdom? Ruling a kingdom and daring everyone to question who you love. And if that was how James expressed affection, what about obsession? 8. James risks obsession with young male favorites. James. I wasn't subtle, and he wasn't shy. If kissing his favorites in public raised eyebrows, his relentless, lifelong obsession with a rotating cast of young, beautiful male courtiers ignited outright panic in the corridors of power. The pattern was almost formulaic. A handsome young man would arrive at court, often with limited experience but well-timed cheekbones, and James would elevate him to impossible heights. First came the affectionate letters, then the titles, then the influence. Always influence. What began as personal favoritism quickly mutated into political dependency. The first of these obsessions, Esme Stuart, caused such alarm in Scotland that nobles forced the king to exile him, accusing him of corrupting the monarch. James wept so bitterly he reportedly nearly collapsed. But that was just the beginning. Then came Robert Carr, whom James met after the young man fell from his horse during a joust. The king, enchanted, had him nursed back to health, and shortly afterward, knighted, promoted, and placed on the Privy Council. Carr, too, was eventually dragged down by scandal involving a poisoning case and the king's frantic personal efforts to shield him. And finally, George Villiers, the most notorious of all. Later, the Duke of Buckingham, Villiers became James's constant companion. The king referred to him in letters as "my sweet child and wife," and wrote with florid intensity, declaring how he longed for his presence. They traveled together, slept in adjacent rooms, and shared gifts, secrets, and possibly state decisions. Pamphlets exploded. Parliament grumbled. Nobles fumed. But James stood firm. "You may be sure," he wrote to Villiers, "that I love the Earl more than anyone else." And Villiers knew it. His power was immense and unearned. His arrogance matched it. He bullied council members, reshaped policies, and acted like a co-monarch. Historians now widely accept that James's favoritism went far beyond political alliances. His letters are explicit in their devotion. His behavior at court was openly affectionate. His choices were consistent, deliberate, and personal. Was it love? Obsession? Emotional dependence? Likely a volatile mix of all three. James was a man who had lost his mother young, been raised under suspicion, and lived a life where affection was currency. Perhaps obsession was his way of maintaining control. Or perhaps it was the only intimacy he could trust. In any case, the rumor was true. James was fixated, some say dangerously so, on a series of young male courtiers who became more than favorites. They were his sanctuary, his weakness, and sometimes his undoing. Because when a king is ruled by obsession, the court is ruled by chaos. And that chaos? It wasn't limited to love. Sometimes it was sold for cash. 9. Charles I, selling aristocratic titles for cash. If James I's court was a stage play of favoritism, Charles I was a financial Ponzi scheme in a powdered wig. Early in his reign, Charles faced a chronic problem. He needed money. Parliament, increasingly rebellious and Puritan, wasn't eager to fund the king's whims or his wars. So Charles improvised. He looked at the one thing England had plenty of, ambition. Then he slapped a price tag on it. Rumors began to circulate that titles, once earned through centuries of bloodshed, loyalty, and noble lineage, could now be bought like trinkets at a market stall. Knighthoods, baronetcies, even peerages were said to be up for sale. The aristocracy scoffed. The merchants leaned in. And as it turns out, the rumors were entirely true. Desperate for funds, Charles revived and expanded the sale of titles, first initiated under his father. Baronetcy, for example, could be purchased for a fixed price, with proceeds ostensibly going to fund the army in Ireland. Spoiler, much of it didn't. Entire generations of newly minted nobility emerged, wealthy, titled, and entirely unproven. But the scheme didn't stop there. Court insiders began brokering deals. If you had enough coin and the right whisper in the right ear, you could become Sir by supper. The old nobility raged. To them, this was an erosion of centuries of blood rights. To Charles, it was just good business. Financial records, treasury accounts, and council documents from the era confirmed the scope of the operation. The crown raked in significant sums, but at an enormous political cost. It alienated Parliament. It enraged landowners. It corrupted the value of the very institutions that gave the monarchy its prestige. Even foreign observers mocked the king's desperation. One French diplomat reportedly quipped that in England, a nobleman can be made for less than the cost of a French wig. Eventually, this erosion of trust helped fuel the broader unrest that exploded into the English Civil War. Charles had traded aristocratic legitimacy for liquidity, and once Parliament realized they held the purse strings, the monarchy itself began to wobble. Modern historians point to this moment as a turning point. Charles wasn't just selling titles. He was mortgaging his authority, undermining the divine right by turning it into a retail strategy. And once the price of nobility was known, its meaning was permanently devalued. Because if everyone can buy greatness, then no one has to respect it. And if royal blood can be outbid, just wait until we get to the king who had illegitimate children on every continent. 10. Charles III's illegitimate children everywhere. Rumor. For a man with no legitimate heirs, Charles II somehow managed to populate an entire shadow family tree. According to official record, he died childless. According to court whispers, and later, court confirmations, he was anything but. Even during his lifetime, the rumors spread like wildfire. Charles II, they said, was fathering children left and right, across the city, across social classes, across national borders. There was no subtlety about it. When a new child appeared mysteriously titled, or an actress mysteriously comfortable, people knew. Not assumed, knew. It became a national pastime, speculating whose son bore the royal profile, whose daughter looked suspiciously Stuart-like. And to no one's great surprise, a number of these rumors turned out to be entirely true. Charles officially acknowledged 14 illegitimate children, more than any other English monarch. These weren't just bastards shuffled off to farms or hidden in monasteries. He gave them titles, He made them dukes. Dukes of Monmouth, Grafton, St. Albans, Richmond, all descended from women Charles seduced, supported, or more accurately, strategically placed across the city like royal chess pieces. He had entire lineages springing from the wings of theaters and the backstairs of court, and those were just the ones he admitted to. Historians believe the real number may have been far higher, perhaps dozens more, scattered throughout England and France, some living quiet lives, others blending into the nobility under a cloud of knowing winks. Diaries, court records, ambassador reports. They all point to a man who treated procreation as both a hobby and an obligation. He didn't just charm women, he kept them, installed them, and funded the offspring they produced like a sovereign seed bank. The merry monarch didn't hide his behavior. In fact, he seemed to relish in it. When confronted about his failure to produce a legitimate heir, he shrugged. "I'm the father of many children, though none lawful." It was the sort of line that made the Puritans rage and the playwrights cheer. And yet, beneath the laughter was an institutional problem. These children, while technically excluded from succession, still wielded immense power. Their titles gave them influence. Their parentage gave them proximity. The Duke of Monmouth, Charles's eldest acknowledged bastard, was even rumored to be considered for the throne, an idea that sparked tension, rebellions, and eventual tragedy. So yes, the rumor was true. Charles II didn't just father a nation, he sprinkled it with dynastic wildcards. And while his official line died out, many of today's aristocratic families still trace their roots back to his extracurricular activities. Because when the monarchy fails to provide an heir, sometimes it just provides everyone else. And what happens when those women didn't stay quiet? That brings us to what happened after the affair ended. 11. Queen Anne's compulsive eating episodes. History remembers Queen Anne for a tragic string of personal losses, 17 pregnancies, no surviving heir, and for looking increasingly like a caricature of grief and indulgence. But behind the powdered wigs and royal portraits lay an uncomfortable whisper that grew louder with every year of her reign, that Anne ate to excess, compulsively, publicly, that she was, in the words of some gossips, a bottomless feast disguised as a monarch. The rumors weren't kind. They painted a picture of a queen whose appetite outpaced her etiquette, who found comfort in food the way others found it in prayer. Of course, royal courts are gossip factories. Every tick of behavior is exaggerated, politicized, or twisted into scandal. But in Anne's case, the whispers would later be supported by something rarer: documentation. Medical records from her personal physicians confirm that Anne suffered from chronic gout, diabetes, and obesity-related complications that were directly linked to her eating habits. Diaries and letters from her attendants quietly note repeated episodes of binge eating, especially following miscarriages, political defeats, or personal betrayals. What seemed like an indulgence to the public may have been something far more familiar and far more human: grief management. Anne's closest confidant, Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, wrote bitterly about the Queen's weight and eating habits after the two women fell out. Her tone was cruel, but her observations, recorded in detail, reflected the court's quiet knowledge. Anne ate more when distressed, and she was almost always distressed. And yet, amid the snickers and scribbled jokes, what no one wanted to admit was that Queen Anne was dealing with the psychological fallout of unimaginable loss. 17 pregnancies. 17 endings. Her body was a battlefield, and food, perhaps, was the only thing she could control. Historians today tread more carefully. Yes, the compulsive eating episodes were real, and they did affect her health and ability to rule effectively in her later years. But they were also part of a larger tragedy. A woman raised to be queen, isolated by trauma, and mocked for coping the only way she could. The image of Queen Anne at a table, surrounded by delicacies, isn't just a caricature of excess. It's a portrait of a monarch abandoned by medicine, misunderstood by society, and crushed by expectation. Because sometimes, the most disgusting rumor is just a very human response to royal-sized pain. And where there's pain, there's rage, which leads us, naturally, to her next reputation. 12. Queen Anne's violent temper tantrums. They called her pious, dull, matronly, when they weren't calling her emotionally unstable. Behind the stiff royal portraits and the heavy gowns, Queen Anne was rumored to possess something dangerously unqueen-like, a volcanic temper. The stories varied. She screamed at ministers, she threw objects, she sobbed, slammed doors, and at least once reportedly refused to speak to anyone for days out of pure spite. In an age where queens were expected to embody grace, Anne, according to whispers, embodied barely contained frustration. The court tried to spin it. The queen is sensitive, they said. She's passionate. But behind the euphemisms was a running tally of outbursts. And after decades of being dismissed as exaggeration, those rumors were finally confirmed by the queen herself, through her own letters and the diaries of those around her. Correspondence between Anne and her confidants reveal frequent emotional surges: anger toward Parliament, jealousy toward Sarah Churchill, despair over betrayal. These weren't dramatic embellishments. They were documented behaviors. In one letter, Anne complains that her blood is raised to such a pitch that she cannot think. In another, she describes being so angry she nearly weeps from exhaustion. Court diaries from politicians and servants alike confirm the trend. Ministers would delay bad news, fearing a blow-up. Attendants developed subtle systems to judge whether the queen's mood was approachable or volatile. This was not a monarch in full command. It was a woman barely hanging on. Some historians argue that these tantrums were symptoms of chronic illness, grief, and psychological strain. Others suggest she was simply human in an inhumane position. Regardless, the image of Anne shrieking at her counsel or icing out friends for imagined slights stuck. And it was only after her death that people stopped whispering and started admitting the obvious. The queen had a temper, and it ruled the court as much as she did. Because absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it often isolates. And isolation, when wrapped in velvet and expectation, doesn't just make you sad, it makes you furious. Which begs the question, if a queen's rage is a scandal, what does it look like when a king turns cruelty into policy? 13. George Voice, imprisoning his wife for life. In royal circles, divorce is messy, but in the case of George I, King of Great Britain and Elector of Hanover, he opted for something cleaner, if slightly medieval, permanent imprisonment. Before he ever set foot in England, George I had already become infamous in the German courts for what many assumed was court gossip. The rumor? That he had locked away his wife, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, for the rest of her natural life. No trial, no reconciliation. Just a quiet vanishing act in a stone fortress. It sounded like the kind of slander enemies would cook up to smear a foreign monarch. But as it turns out, the story wasn't whispered fiction. It was bureaucratically documented truth. Sophia Dorothea, a spirited and popular figure, had married George in a dynastic arrangement neither party wanted. From the outset, their union was a theater of resentment. George was cold, distant, and uninterested in his wife, except to ensure she produced heirs. She, on the other hand, developed a close friendship, and possibly more, with Count Philip von Königsmarck, a Swedish nobleman whose charm may have outpaced his discretion. Rumors of an affair spiraled. Court spies and jealous rivals reported secret meetings, letters, and even plans to flee. Then one day, Königsmarck vanished, forever. Many believed he was murdered on George's orders, his body disposed of beneath the Hanoverian palace. No body was found. No charges were made. Just silence. And then Sophia was gone too, banished to the remote castle of Alden, where she remained for over 30 years. Not exiled to another court, not sent to a convent, literally locked in. She was not permitted to remarry, visit court, or see her children again. Her letters were censored, her name struck from official documents. It was erasure by imprisonment. When George became King of Great Britain in 1714, English society, already skeptical of their foreign monarch, learned of his wife's mysterious absence. Questions circulated. Was she mad? Dead? A traitor? George offered no answers. Officially, she no longer existed. Modern historians and diplomatic archives confirm it all. Sophia was imprisoned for life under royal orders. No legal proceedings, no public explanation. Just a lifetime of silence in a stone tower, visited only by a few loyal servants and, on rare occasions, her own fading memories. It wasn't just a royal falling out. It was a monarch weaponizing captivity as damage control. And when you imprison your wife for life, it says more than a scandal ever could. But sometimes, it's not who you lock away. It's who you let in. And George had very particular tastes in company. 14. George's mistress. Controlling government access. For a king who exiled his wife to a tower, George there was surprisingly open door with his mistress. While Sophia Dorothea languished in isolation, George's mistress, Erengard Melusine von der Schulenburg, was not only at liberty, but allegedly controlling the very levers of power. The rumor at the time was both scandalous and strangely specific. Melusine didn't just share the royal bed, she ran the access list to it, and to the king himself. To understand the full impact of this, you have to grasp just how un-English this arrangement felt. When George I ascended to the British throne, his limited grasp of English and preference for his German entourage already made him suspect. But then came Melusine, arriving not just with luggage but with influence. She was soon granted the title Duchess of Kendal, an English estate, and, most notably, an invisible role as the de facto gatekeeper to the monarch. Rumors poured out of court that ministers and petitioners had to pass through Melusine before gaining audience with the king, that she accepted gifts in exchange for influence, that her apartments were better furnished than those of state officials. She was derided in pamphlets as a German she-wolf, and cartoons depicted her as a puppet master with George dangling from strings. At first, many dismissed it as xenophobic slander. Britain, after all, was already on edge about having a foreign king. But as records emerged and letters were studied, a clearer picture came into focus. Melusine was granting audiences, she was coordinating appointments, and she was influencing political decisions, not through official titles, but through unchallenged proximity. Even George's ministers, especially Robert Walpole, acknowledged her power and made use of it. If you couldn't convince the king, you could often convince Melusine to convince him. That wasn't a rumor. That was realpolitik. Court papers and correspondence confirm that Melusine received frequent requests to intervene on behalf of nobles, merchants, and foreign agents. She was given an annual pension, estates, and enough jewelry to rival a crown treasury. One observer noted that she enjoyed the privileges of a queen without the ceremony of marriage, and yet she remained officially untitled in government. She never held public office. Her power was both unacknowledged and absolute. Like fog in a castle, everyone felt it, but no one could touch it. It's a tale as old as monarchy. When the king shuts out parliament, someone else fills the gap. In George's case, it wasn't a minister or a general. It was Melusine, seated comfortably in silk, politely arranging the empire. And what happens when even the king's mother can't hide her own weakness? 15. George II's mother, hiding a massive hernia. Royal families go to great lengths to appear invulnerable. But Caroline of Ansbach, mother of George II, may have taken it a step too far, by hiding what may have been the most uncomfortable royal secret of the 18th century. The rumor, whispered in salons and scribbled in the margins of medical texts, was simple and mortifying. Queen Caroline had a massive, possibly grotesque hernia, and she hid it. At the time, it sounded like classist mockery, a grotesque exaggeration of female royal aging. But after her death, the truth emerged, and it was worse than anyone guessed. Caroline had, in fact, developed a large umbilical hernia after giving birth to multiple children. The strain on her body, compounded by limited medical knowledge and a likely resistance to surgical intervention, caused the hernia to grow over years. Her doctors knew. Her ladies-in-waiting knew. But it was never publicly acknowledged. The queen wore corsets, layered gowns, and carefully positioned jewelry to distract from her growing abdominal bulge. She reportedly endured increasing pain, but refused to step away from court duties. Letters from physicians and members of her household confirmed that she dealt with chronic discomfort, even as she managed affairs of state behind the scenes for her often absent husband, George I. When she finally became ill in 1737, the true extent of her condition became impossible to hide. Despite being gravely sick, she refused to allow her surgeons to operate. When they finally insisted, she underwent a primitive procedure under harrowing conditions. The details of her final days were recorded in the private diaries of court doctors. What had once been rumor became confirmed fact. Caroline had lived for years with a massive hernia, disguised by layers of decorum, and eventually died from the complications it caused. Why did she hide it? Pride, fear, image. For a woman already holding together the political image of a shaky foreign monarchy, showing weakness was unthinkable. She was the queen, not a patient. Even in agony, she played the part. And the tragedy wasn't just physical. It was symbolic. In the end, Caroline's secret became part of her legend. A queen of formidable intellect, impossible resilience, and a refusal to be seen as anything but regal, even as her body betrayed her. Because in a court built on appearances, sometimes the most dangerous thing a royal can do is admit to being human. 16. George III's wife. Dominating him sexually and politically. For all the bombast of 18th-century masculinity, it was an open secret at court that George II, short, combative, and perpetually red-faced, wasn't entirely in charge. Not at home, not in bed, not in government. That honor, it was whispered, belonged to his wife, Queen Caroline of Ansbach. Even before they crossed the Channel, the gossip had already started. That Caroline didn't just advise her husband, she controlled him. She managed his temper, his mistresses, his ministers, and, according to palace servants, his every movement from bedroom to throne room. The rumors became so common they evolved into a sort of running court joke. George was the king of Britain, but Caroline ruled everything else. This wasn't standard consort behavior. Caroline didn't merely accompany her husband to functions and nod at speeches. She was deeply involved in statecraft, secretly attending cabinet meetings, writing notes to ministers, and manipulating appointments. Robert Walpole, the de facto prime minister, often went to her directly, bypassing the king altogether when decisions needed to be made. How much influence did she have? Enough to drive policy, enough to shape alliances, enough that some called her England's unofficial co-monarch. And yet she operated entirely from the background, publicly deferential, privately omnipotent. The other half of the rumor, whispered in more hushed tones, was that her dominance extended into the private chambers, that George's fiery temper and public rants were compensation for a private life where he wasn't entirely in control. Eyewitnesses, personal letters, and candid remarks from courtiers all suggested that behind closed doors, Caroline made the rules. And the most damning confirmation? George himself. He was utterly dependent on her, emotionally and politically. When she died in 1737, his behavior crumbled. He visited her grave obsessively. He forbade anyone to remove her portrait from his chambers. And he reportedly insisted they be buried together so he could lie beside her in the afterlife, face to face. Modern historians have unpacked these dynamics with cautious detail. Caroline was, without question, the most politically engaged queen consort of her era. And George, for all his royal bluster, relied on her intellect and counsel at every turn. What was once seen as scandalous, her control, her assertiveness, is now recognized as strategy. She didn't dominate him in secret, she governed through him. But in a court built on male power, the idea that the king answered to his wife was both threatening and hilarious, which is why the gossip lasted generations. Because when a monarch is ruled by his consort, the throne becomes a mirror. And sometimes it reflects exactly who's really in charge. Now imagine that same dynamic of control and collapse turned inward, toward the king's own mind. 17. George III, talking to trees. During breakdowns. By the end of the 18th century, the British crown was less a symbol of divine right and more a case study in mental collapse. No monarch embodied this more than George III, whose most enduring legacy wasn't victory or lawmaking, but what people whispered behind his back, that he talked to trees. At first, the story seemed absurd. A king conversing with oaks and whispering to branches like old friends? A neat metaphor, surely, for political isolation or the burden of power. But then the details accumulated. Reports from courtiers, physicians, and even foreign dignitaries began to align. George III, during his episodes of madness, did indeed walk through the gardens and speak aloud to trees, as if they were ministers, courtiers, even lost relatives. The story was long dismissed as a product of satire, an exaggeration born from newspapers desperate for scandal and Whig pamphleteers eager to mock the monarchy. But in the 20th century, the records were re-examined, and what had once been caricature turned out to be medically documented truth. George suffered from bouts of what his physicians called madness, episodes marked by rapid speech, erratic behavior, insomnia, and vivid hallucinations. The Royal Archives now contain detailed observations from Dr. Francis Willis and others who treated him, confirming the nature of these episodes. Among them, long walks in the royal gardens, where George was witnessed speaking emotionally to trees, sometimes bowing to them, sometimes referring to them by name. Today, many believe George III suffered from a genetic disorder called porphyria, a condition that can cause severe mental disturbances and physical symptoms. Others argue his symptoms align more closely with bipolar disorder or acute mania. Whatever the exact diagnosis, the result was the same. The King of England, during certain periods, lost touch with reality. And the trees? They were never random. Some historians believe George saw them as symbolic, representatives of court members, echoes of conversations past, or simply the only entities in his life that didn't judge him. After all, unlike Parliament, trees don't argue back. The public reaction at the time was a mix of horror and relief. The image of the monarch communing with bark and branches confirmed what many feared. The king was not fit to rule. Eventually, his son was appointed regent. The monarchy was effectively split between body and mind. But the image remains, strange, sad, and poetic. A once powerful monarch, pacing through his manic world, finding solace in the one part of court that didn't talk back. Because when power fails, when reason collapses, and when even the walls whisper judgment, sometimes a tree feels like the only safe audience. And when the talking stops, the rage begins. 18. George III's violent manic episodes. Before the whispers of trees, there were shouts from inside the palace walls. George III didn't just descend into madness quietly. He erupted. The rumors at the time were terrifying, that the king would scream for hours, tear off his clothes, lash out at those around him, and rage at invisible foes. Ministers tiptoed. Servants fled. The monarchy, it seemed, had become an asylum with a crown. The public, at first, dismissed these stories as treasonous exaggeration. Surely the king was unwell, but violent, unstable, uncontrollable? That seemed like pamphlet fodder, not reality. Until it wasn't. Detailed medical accounts, including those from Dr. Willis and later Dr. Robert Darwin, father of Charles, reveal the full extent of George's suffering. He would go without sleep for days, speak at such rapid speeds his words became incoherent, and fluctuate between euphoric declarations and terrifying aggression. He would pace for hours, weep uncontrollably, and at times grow physically violent, not as a tyrant, but as a man completely overwhelmed by his own mind. Witnesses described how attendants had to restrain him for his own safety. He was kept in isolation. His meals were monitored. He occasionally recognized no one, not his wife, not his doctors, not even his own name. One of the most striking observations came from a servant who said, "He is the king in title, but a stranger now wears his face." This wasn't just mental illness. It was a full breakdown of royal image. The man who once represented stability and British resilience was now a walking contradiction. Powerful yet powerless, sacred yet broken. Parliament tried to keep it secret, but eventually the truth bled into the public sphere. Caricatures showed a drooling king. Satirical plays hinted at a mad ruler guarded by trembling aides. Today, historians have sifted through the chaos with clinical eyes. The consensus? George suffered genuine manic episodes compounded by illness, pressure, and ignorance. His condition was worsened by 18th century treatments, including blistering, restraint, and forced isolation. The palace wasn't a sanctuary. It was a gilded madhouse. But what makes this rumor more than just scandalous is how it reframed kingship. George's madness didn't come from weakness. It came from being crushed under the unbearable weight of ruling, grieving, and never being allowed to fall apart. Because even monarchs, wrapped in velvet and tradition, sometimes shatter. And when a king breaks publicly, what else might he be hiding privately? Especially in matters of the heart. 19. George IV. Secretly marrying Maria Fitzherbert. In the tangled bramble of royal romance, few stories have as much whispered scandal and political embarrassment as George IV's relationship with Maria Fitzherbert. For decades, the British elite gossiped that the prince had married a Catholic widow in secret, an illegal union, utterly invalid under English law, and a constitutional crisis waiting to happen. The palace called it fiction. Fitzherbert denied it publicly. George lied with practiced charm. But after his death, the truth spilled out like a torn curtain. The secret marriage had happened. The rumors were real, and they had been very carefully hidden. Maria Fitzherbert was no courtesan. She was a twice-widowed Catholic noblewoman with money, manners, and her own townhouse in Mayfair. She had no ambition to become queen, just peace, privacy, and a life unbothered by court. George, on the other hand, was a prince addicted to drama, debt, and the thrill of pursuing what he was forbidden to have. When George fell for her in the 1780s, he did so with performative obsession. Love letters, extravagant gifts, suicidal threats. At one point, he claimed he would kill himself if she didn't agree to marry him. And eventually, under pressure and some say emotional blackmail, she consented. In 1785, they were married in a private ceremony by a Church of England clergyman, an act which, under the Royal Marriages Act, was not just void, but potentially treasonous if exposed. Because Maria was Catholic and George was heir to a Protestant throne, no member of the royal family could legally marry a Catholic, not in public, not in private, not at all. For decades, the story remained a rumor. Fitzherbert lived quietly, received polite recognition, and kept her secrets. George moved on to other affairs, eventually marrying Princess Caroline in a political union so disastrous it made his fake marriage look idyllic by comparison. But even then, George often returned to Maria emotionally, if not physically. After his death in 1830, a tin box in his private chambers was discovered. Inside were Maria's letters and tokens of their relationship. The documents confirmed the ceremony, the relationship, and George's lifelong insistence that she was his true wife. Parliament quietly closed the matter. Historians now view the Fitzherbert affair as both romantic and farcical. Romantic, in that George defied his family and government for love. Farcical because he had neither the authority nor the discipline to make it work. But beneath the sentimentality was something darker. A prince so disconnected from constitutional reality that he believed love could overrule law. And a woman forced to live in the shadows to preserve the monarchy's illusion of order. Because when the future king breaks the rules of succession for a secret ceremony, it's not just love, it's a liability. And when love leads to deception, the body often follows. Which brings us to George IV's next infamous legacy. 20. George IV's severe obesity and gluttony. George IV was a man of appetites. For women, for fashion, for acclaim, and above all, for food. During his reign as Prince Regent and later as king, he was the subject of countless jokes, caricatures, and not-so-subtle pamphlets, suggesting he was quite literally eating the empire out of its linens. The rumor was that George didn't just eat well, he ate excessively, obsessively, grotesquely. That his banquets were legendary, his snacks constant, and his waistline ever-expanding. At court, they whispered about custom-built trousers, collapsing chairs, and a monarch whose profile had become spherical. But was it all satire? Surprisingly, no. Medical reports and eyewitness accounts confirmed that George's health was spiraling due to compulsive overeating and a lack of restraint. By the later years of his life, George weighed over 20 stone, around 280 pounds, was barely able to walk unaided, and suffered from gout, shortness of breath, and mobility issues. He reportedly consumed multiple course breakfasts, elaborate lunches, and dinners that could feed an entire battalion. He had a particular fondness for rich French cuisine, brandy, cream-laced desserts, and roasted meats, often in absurd quantities. One guest wrote that George ate like a man condemned, as if every meal were his last, and he intended to enjoy it to the fullest. But the problem wasn't just personal, it was political. George's visible decline became a metaphor for the decay of royal authority itself. While the nation wrestled with war debts, political reform, and growing social unrest, their king was rumored to be ordering custom-built furniture to accommodate his ever-growing form. Satirical prints by artists like James Gilray and George Cruikshank amplified the mockery. They depicted George as a bloated figure, staggering through excess, draped in jewels and meat. The monarchy's dignity had become a joke with gravy stains. Behind the ridicule, though, was a deeper story. George had been raised in a system that offered unlimited privilege with minimal discipline. He was shielded from consequence and surrounded by sycophants. Food became not just sustenance, but comfort, control, and escapism. His growing body mirrored his shrinking ability to face reality. Modern biographers agree, his obesity wasn't just vanity gone wrong, but a physical manifestation of deeper emotional collapse. Anxiety, loneliness, and disillusionment found their expression in compulsive indulgence. Because when the king can't stop feeding himself, the country begins to starve for leadership. And as his stomach grew, so too did another rumor, one soaked not in gravy but in gin. 21. George IV's massive alcohol dependency. By the time George IV reached middle age, his public appearances had become unpredictable, his speeches slurred, and his decisions erratic. The reason, court gossips claimed, was simple. He was always drinking, and not just the occasional toast. The rumor was that George IV was a full-time connoisseur of intoxication, one whose fondness for brandy, fortified wines, and spirits had grown from aristocratic habit into full-blown dependence. At first, it seemed like standard royal indulgence. Monarchs drank. That was expected. But in George's case, the whispers turned to concern, and concern to confirmation. By the late 1810s, ministers were quietly noting the king's mental and physical decline. Physicians kept increasingly detailed logs. He would appear at council meetings unable to concentrate, red-faced and jittery, sometimes unable to stay awake. These weren't signs of aging. These were symptoms of a system slowly collapsing under alcohol's weight. George's daily intake was described by his valet as steady and impossible. He reportedly began the day with brandy or fortified wine, and often ended it in the same way. Guests at royal dinners remarked on the number of glasses he could consume without pause. There were stories, backed by court letters, that wine cellars had to be reinforced to handle his consumption levels. It wasn't entertainment, it was a regimen. But this wasn't just about drink. It was about escape. The king was increasingly isolated, alienated from his subjects, estranged from his wife, mocked by the press. The bottle became both shield and sword, numbing him against the constant reminders that the monarchy was changing, and he was being left behind. As with his eating habits, George's drinking became a public spectacle. Caricatures showed him slumped over casks. Pamphlets referred to him as His Boozy Majesty. Even Parliament struggled to ignore it, with ministers quietly limiting his public appearances to avoid embarrassment. Modern historians confirm that George likely suffered from long-term alcohol use disorder, with all the attendant complications, liver issues, cognitive decline, mood swings, and chronic bloating. He was, in effect, drinking himself into invisibility, and in the end, that's what happened. He withdrew from view, retreating into Windsor Castle, surrounded by food, drink, and his own distorted reflection. Because when a king loses himself to indulgence, the court stops waiting for orders and starts waiting for the funeral. But before that came something even stranger. Not gluttony, not drink, but a royal wardrobe malfunction so peculiar, it defied every rule of dignity. 22. George IV. Cross-dressed at private parties. If there was one thing George IV hated more than criticism, it was being bored. And while his reign gave Britain a legacy of architectural splendor, lavish fashion, and political instability, it also gave historians one of the stranger rumors of royal indulgence: that the king, while Prince of Wales, enjoyed dressing in women's clothing, sometimes for private parties, sometimes just for himself. At first, this rumor seemed like classic Regency slander. George had no shortage of enemies: radicals, reformists, Puritans, and everyone in between. Pamphleteers accused him of gluttony, drunkenness, cowardice, and effeminacy. The image of the prince parading around in dresses seemed too perfectly scandalous to be true. And yet, it was. Accounts from courtiers, domestic staff, and contemporaneous observers, not to mention later biographies, confirm that George's private parties, especially during his years as Prince Regent, were extravagant affairs where social norms were bent, blurred, or entirely ignored. Fancy dress balls were fashionable at the time, and George took the concept to theatrical extremes. On multiple occasions, he attended such gatherings in full female costume, complete with silk gowns, powdered wigs, and even corsets. Some of these parties were exclusive to his inner circle: aristocrats, theater performers, and members of high society who understood the unspoken rule of royal discretion. Within those walls, George was free to experiment, not just with food and drink, but with identity, appearance, and performance. Eyewitnesses, like diarist Nathaniel Wraxall and novelist Thomas Creevey, made cryptic references to the prince's flamboyant appearances, noting his fondness for theatrical attire and his peculiar delight in costumes that reversed expectation. While they didn't spell it out, the implication was clear. Behind the palace walls, the future king was rewriting dress codes. To the broader public, these stories were whispered, hinted at, and only occasionally printed, always with plausible deniability. The monarchy's defenders dismissed them as exaggeration, or the bitter inventions of reformist critics. But the sheer volume of consistent, overlapping accounts tells another story. George wasn't alone in this. Cross-dressing among the aristocracy was more common than later generations might assume, especially in an age where fashion itself was theatrical, gender roles were socially rigid, and rebellion took the form of lace and powdered rouge. For George, whose entire life had been stage-managed since infancy, playing with presentation was a form of private agency. But there was a price. To the public, already disgusted by his excess and disillusioned by his politics, the idea of a prince who played dress-up while the country faced recession and reform was more than just amusing, it was damning. It confirmed their suspicions that he was unserious, disconnected, and dangerously vain. Today, historians approach the story with nuance. George's cross-dressing wasn't an open secret, but it was an open whisper. Whether it was done for comedy, control, or comfort, it reflected a man who found more pleasure in illusion than governance. Because when the royal robes grow heavy, sometimes the crown feels lighter in a wig and heels. And if the king dressed like someone else to escape scrutiny, what happens when his own bloodline starts looking a little suspicious? 23. William IV, fathering 10 illegitimate children. If George IV was a peacock in pearls, his brother William IV was more of a pub landlord with a crown, less theatrical, more blunt, and no less scandal-prone. And while George was accused of illegitimacy in spirit, William delivered it in fact. The rumor was simple and widespread. William, long before he became king, had fathered not one, not two, but 10 illegitimate children with an actress named Dorothea Jordan. At the time, it was dismissed as sensational gossip, fueled by anti-monarchist propaganda and resentment toward the flamboyant royal family. 10 children? Surely that was exaggerated. Except it wasn't. The truth, as confirmed by genealogical research, official documents, and correspondence, is that William did in fact live with Dorothea Jordan for over 2 decades in what amounted to a domestic partnership, and they had 10 children together, known collectively as the Fitzclarences. Their surnames marked them unmistakably as royal bastards. And unlike his brother George, William didn't hide them. He gave them allowances, education, and in several cases, arranged advantageous marriages. Dorothea, though never formally recognized as his wife, was treated as a consort in all but name, attending royal events, appearing in public with William, and managing their household with quiet dignity. This arrangement was both shocking and strangely wholesome. For a time, William lived more like a middle-class gentleman than a prince. He was ridiculed for it, called Sailor Billy by critics, mocked for his domestic simplicity. But to many, it made him oddly relatable. He wasn't a theatrical dandy like his brother, or a cold strategist like their father. He was just William, loud, direct, slightly chaotic, and unashamed of his complicated personal life. When William finally ascended the throne in 1830, he was a widower. Dorothea had long since died, and he was forced to set aside the Fitzclarence legacy in favor of royal respectability. But the children remained close. He made several of them peers, bishops, and officials. The eldest, George Fitzclarence, became the Earl of Munster. And yet, their existence was still a problem. To some in Parliament, the Fitzclarences represented the embarrassing truth that the monarchy wasn't sacred. It was just another dysfunctional family with good tailoring. Reformers used William's paternal record as ammunition in debates about inheritance, privilege, and morality. Could a king with 10 illegitimate children be taken seriously as a moral authority? And if titles were given to bastards, what did that say about the legitimacy of the entire aristocracy? Modern historians view William IV's scandal with an oddly affectionate lens. Yes, it broke norms. Yes, it challenged royal protocol. But unlike the cruel neglect or covert payments of other monarchs, William seemed to genuinely care for his children. He didn't pretend they didn't exist. He acknowledged them, raised them, and loved them openly. Because sometimes the real scandal isn't in the secret. It's in telling the truth too plainly. And when the king lets his mistress play queen, the court doesn't just gossip, it panics. 24. William IV's mistress, pretending to be his wife. In the careful choreography of royal public life, titles matter. Who's a lady? Who's a duchess? who's merely present. These things are recorded, calculated, and obsessed over by generations of historians and gossips alike. Which is why the long-standing rumor about William IV's mistress, Dorothea Jordan, pretending, or rather, being treated, as his unofficial wife, sent clerks and courtiers into fits. Dorothea Jordan was not a secret. She was a famous actress, well known on the London stage, beloved by the public, and undeniably charismatic. She met William when he was the Duke of Clarence, and the two began a relationship that lasted over 20 years. A rarity in any royal circle. The problem? She wasn't nobility. She wasn't married to him, and she absolutely wasn't supposed to be attending royal functions as if she were. Yet that's exactly what happened. At a time when the royal family was under intense scrutiny, embroiled in scandals ranging from debts to duels, William's domestic life became the subject of intense, fascinated gossip. The rumor wasn't just that he had a mistress. That was expected. The scandal was that she was essentially filling the role of duchess. She appeared at public events with him. She managed his household. She sat beside him in carriages, issued invitations, and was referred to in casual speech as Mrs. Fitz-Clarence, a respectful nod that made clear she was more than just a fling. Court records show that invitations from William's household often bore both their names. Letters between political figures reveal frustration, not at the affair itself, but at the optics of it. One minister complained that His Royal Highness blurs the line between personal and official life to a degree most inconvenient. In other words, Dorothea's visibility was the problem. The truth of the matter is simple. Dorothea Jordan played the part of William's consort because William let her. In private, she governed the domestic aspects of their shared home at Bushy House. In public, he deferred to her presence in a way that suggested more than affection. It suggested partnership. They had 10 children together, all bearing the surname Fitz-Clarence, and William provided for them generously. But he never married her, because he legally couldn't without forfeiting his royal position. Still, by every social marker short of law, she was his wife. The arrangement only ended when political necessity forced William to separate from her and seek a more acceptable royal match, eventually marrying Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen. Even then, the ghost of Dorothea's presence lingered. Adelaide reportedly treated the Fitz-Clarence children with kindness, and William never denied the depth of his past relationship. Dorothea's name was not stricken from memory. She was, in many ways, mourned like a widow would be. The official story pretended otherwise, but the public and history knew the truth. Modern historians see in Dorothea Jordan a unique figure, a commoner who rose not by marriage, but by merit and affection, to occupy a role few women in her position ever held. She was scandalous only because she was visible and visibly competent. Because sometimes, the most offensive thing a mistress can do isn't seduce a prince. It's act like a queen. And if a monarch could bend protocol for love, imagine what happens when that love turns into obsession, and that obsession becomes a national secret buried in the Queen's own diary. 25. Queen Victoria's obsession with John Brown. If Queen Victoria had been a character in one of her era's Gothic novels, her story with John Brown would have been considered too melodramatic, too implausible, too emotional for polite society. And yet, in real life, it was all true. Every last rumor of impropriety, obsession, and whispered scandal about the Queen and her Scottish servant. John Brown was not a nobleman. He was a rugged Highland gillie, originally hired by Prince Albert to serve as a personal outdoor attendant. After Albert's death in 1861, Victoria descended into prolonged mourning, withdrawing from public life for years. During this time, Brown rose to unexpected prominence. He wasn't promoted in rank, he simply became unavoidable. The rumor was simple and deliciously scandalous, that Queen Victoria, Empress of India, had fallen deeply, perhaps even romantically, in love with a common servant. Worse, that she allowed him unprecedented access to her private chambers, addressed him with informal affection, and took his advice more seriously than that of her ministers. These rumors, whispered first at court and later printed in biting editorials, were long dismissed as exaggerated grief-fueled hysteria. But Victoria's own diaries, letters, and the recollections of her household tell a very different story. Victoria referred to Brown as her best friend, her constant companion, and in one letter as "my dear Brown." He was granted his own room near hers in Balmoral, was known to argue with her directly, and escorted her on nearly all her private outings. The Queen's daughters referred to him, half affectionately, half scandalously, as Mama's lover, though never in public. The tension wasn't just romantic implication, it was power. Brown could speak to the Queen with a frankness no one else dared. He reportedly once told her to stop whining and get on with it during a particularly low point. She listened. Ministers complained. He stayed. After Brown's death in 1883, Victoria mourned with an intensity that astonished even her family. She commissioned statues of him. She had paintings made. She insisted he be buried with a lock of her hair, and upon her own death in 1901, a photograph of John Brown was placed in her coffin, along with a ring he had once given her. Later, when royal archives were examined, it was discovered that entire sections of her diaries had been edited, by her daughter Beatrice no less, to remove passages referring to Brown. The rumor wasn't just true, it had been deliberately hidden. What made the story so potent and so offensive to the Victorian mind wasn't just the idea of romance. It was intimacy without title, emotion without approval. Brown was the anti-Prince Albert, blunt, earthy, emotionally accessible. And Victoria, who spent her reign projecting moral authority, had a private life that threatened to collapse that projection entirely. Today, historians debate the exact nature of their relationship, but none dispute its depth. The Queen wasn't just close to Brown. She was, by every written measure, consumed by him. Because when grief becomes obsession, and obsession becomes identity, the crown becomes little more than another thing to hide behind. 26. Victoria. Sleeping with Brown's clothes for comfort. There's a moment in royal history where grief eclipses protocol. It doesn't come with trumpet fanfare or public decrees. It comes in candlelit rooms, long silences, and odd private habits that no one is supposed to notice. For Queen Victoria, that moment lingered for decades, and the rumors it spawned were so intimate, so frankly strange, that they were buried alongside her. After the death of Prince Albert in 1861, Victoria entered a mourning period that never truly ended. She withdrew from public life, wore black for the rest of her reign, and transformed Windsor Castle into a mausoleum of memories. But it wasn't just marble statues and court restrictions. The gossip that quietly made its way through the drawing rooms of London and the pages of foreign dispatches was far more personal. That Victoria, the sovereign of the world's largest empire, slept with the clothes of her servant, John Brown. At first, the claim was too bizarre to believe. A queen curled up beside a worn jacket or shirt from a bearded Highlander? It sounded more like Victorian fan fiction than reality. But over time, the fragments began to coalesce. Letters, journal entries, and eyewitness accounts from members of the royal household painted a picture not of absurdity, but of raw emotional dependence. When Brown passed away in 1883, Victoria wrote of being utterly broken. Her surviving correspondence reveals that she kept his personal effects close, particularly his plaid cloak and his boots. These weren't boxed away in some sanitized memory chest. They were placed near her bed. In Balmoral, the boots were kept under her pillow. Multiple palace servants reported that she would touch them before sleeping, sometimes even weep while holding them. It wasn't just grief. It was ritual. A tactile routine built on loss. The cloak, too, was often found draped on a nearby chair, sometimes over her own lap during solitary evenings. The queen, who had once ruled over generals and diplomats, was retreating into the smallest acts of comfort. And at the center of it all was the ghost of John Brown. Family members were disturbed. Ministers were furious. And the press, once they caught wind of it, veiled their mockery in coded language. The queen has taken to peculiar evening habits, one anonymous court column stated in 1884, and finds comfort in what would be considered rustic remnants. Everyone knew what it meant. The official line, of course, remained firm. John Brown was her loyal servant, her best friend, nothing more. But behind the polished portraits and carefully crafted statements, Victoria was fighting an emotional war, and losing. After losing Albert, she had found in Brown a sense of grounding. When he died, the loss was like being widowed all over again. Except this time, she couldn't mourn publicly. She couldn't build statues. She couldn't write odes. She had to pretend, so she turned to the tangible, to the jacket that smelled like the hills of Balmoral, to the boots that had walked beside her carriage, to the touchstones that kept her from dissolving entirely. Modern scholars have stopped debating whether Victoria kept Brown's clothes near her. The evidence is overwhelming. What they debate now is what it means. Was it obsessive? Was it romantic? Was it the final unraveling of a woman exhausted by death, protocol, and decades of enforced dignity? Perhaps the answer is simpler. Perhaps Victoria, the most powerful woman in the world, just needed something real to hold on to. Because when your kingdom is made of iron and marble, sometimes all you want is wool and leather. And when emotion becomes something too fragile for the public to witness, the crown starts hiding more than state secrets. 27. Victoria, ordering Brown's portrait. Hidden. There's something ominous about a monarch trying to erase a face from history, not by declaring it false, but by locking it away. After John Brown's death in 1883, Queen Victoria began a quiet but determined campaign, not to forget him, but to hide him, to smother the visual memory of a man she had once celebrated more openly than most of her own children. The story began with his portrait. At Balmoral in Windsor, there had once been paintings of Brown, not official court commissions, but personal likenesses. One in particular, painted with surprising softness, hung in one of her private rooms. It wasn't large, it wasn't ostentatious, but it was undeniably affectionate. The Queen had praised it. She referred to it in letters, and then suddenly she ordered it removed. The rumor at the time was simple and perplexing. Victoria had banished Brown's image from view. Some said she couldn't bear to see it. Others said her advisors had finally stepped in, demanding that the memory of Brown be scrubbed clean for the sake of the monarchy. But the real story was more complicated, and far more telling. Private correspondences between Victoria and her daughter Princess Beatrice, who acted as her de facto secretary in later years, reveal that the Queen instructed certain portraits of Brown to be removed from her residences, not destroyed, just stored, tucked away in attics or behind locked cabinet doors. Other paintings were hidden within layers of other art, or their subjects misattributed in inventory lists. Why would she do this? Because the whispers never stopped. Even after Brown's death, foreign diplomats and domestic critics continued to refer to the Queen's devotion with suspicion. Some believed she had married him in secret, an allegation so persistent it made its way into official intelligence memos. Others said the Queen had gone mad from grief. The portrait, then, became more than paint on canvas. It was evidence. And Victoria, ruler though she was still a woman surrounded by men who controlled her narrative. There was a second layer to this erasure. After Victoria's death in 1901, her son, Edward VII, took it further. He ordered many of Brown's personal belongings removed from the royal residences. Statues were taken down, letters were burned, and portraits, especially the tender ones, were either destroyed or sealed in vaults. It wasn't just the end of a reign, it was the beginning of a deliberate sanitization. Brown had been too visible, too familiar, too intimate, and so history did what it often does. It edited. But not completely. Some portraits survived, some letters slipped through, and historians, piecing together the fragments, have confirmed the rumor. Queen Victoria did indeed order Brown's likeness hidden, not because she stopped loving him, but perhaps because the world refused to understand it. Because when you're a monarch, even grief becomes suspicious. And love, especially unconventional love, must be repackaged, redacted, or erased. But no matter how many portraits you hide, the past always stares back. And sometimes it stares from a brothel chair across the channel, custom built for royalty. 28. Edward VII's elaborate love chair rumor. There are royal scandals, and then there are royal furnishings. Edward VII, long before he ascended the throne, managed to blur the line between the two with such decadent absurdity that even seasoned courtiers struggled to speak about it with a straight face. The rumor was both precise and outrageous, that the future king had commissioned a custom-built chair from a Parisian brothel, not for sitting but for logistics. An object so baroque in design and so direct in purpose that it made even the most permissive Victorians blink. At first, it sounded like a parody, a decadent royal with too much money and too much time, indulging in a piece of Rococo kink furniture. The story swirled through polite society, was whispered about in clubs, and written in code in foreign press dispatches. And yet for years it remained unverified, too scandalous to confirm, too detailed to dismiss, until the chair itself surfaced. Tucked away in the archives of the legendary Parisian brothel Le Chabanais, a photograph and preserved documentation revealed that yes, such a contraption had been commissioned. And yes, it bore the unmistakable royal seal of approval. Made of fine wood, brass fittings, and leather straps, the so-called love chair was a mechanical device engineered to solve a rather regal problem: Edward VII's size. By the time Edward was in his mid-40s, he had grown corpulent, luxuriously so. His girth, combined with his legendary stamina for pleasure, made traditional intimacy somewhat impractical. Hence, the chair. It was designed to allow him to recline comfortably while companions did most of the acrobatics. The mechanics are best left to the imagination. But suffice it to say, it was less of a chair and more of a human rotisserie with upholstery. The brothel kept records. They referred to the piece as La Chaise d'amour du roi d'Angleterre. It was said to have remained in use for decades, preserved more as a trophy than a tool. Staff at Le Chabanais allegedly used it as proof of their establishment's elite clientele. In the realm of scandal, it was a showpiece. Literally. Why did this matter? Because Edward VII, despite his indulgences, was not some peripheral noble. He was the heir to Queen Victoria, the symbol of moral restraint, decorum, and imperial piety. And here he was, funding innovations in carnal furniture, while Europe teetered into modernity. To his credit, or fault, Edward never denied it. In fact, he seemed almost amused by the whispers. He once told a courtier that Paris understands hospitality better than Parliament ever will. That's the closest he came to acknowledging the truth, but the reality was etched into wood and rivets. The chair was real. The rumors were true. Historians today view the love chair as more than titillation. It was a metaphor for Edward's life. Comfort above all else, performance as lifestyle, pleasure turned into administration. He didn't just seek pleasure, he curated it, like an imperial collection. Because when your royal duties feel like furniture, you make the furniture do the work. And if the chair held the weight of indulgence, the cigars were what burned everything down. Slowly, stylishly, and fatally. 29. Edward VII's cigar addiction. Ruining his health. If Edward VII was known for one thing besides his extracurricular lifestyle, it was the cigar. Thick, imported, and always in hand, it became his unofficial scepter, waved at guests, puffed through treaties, and smoldering in nearly every photograph taken of him post-40. The man didn't just smoke cigars. He inhaled them like diplomatic obligations, constantly, purposefully, and with no regard for consequence. The rumor began early in his public life. That Edward smoked so many cigars, it had begun to affect his health. His voice was rough. His breath was labored. He reportedly coughed his way through dinners and left ash trails through palace corridors. At court, whispers circled that he couldn't function without tobacco, that cigars were less of a hobby and more of a bodily requirement. At first, the public laughed it off. After all, Edward made no attempt to hide his habit. He was seen lighting up between speeches, during travel, even during hunts. He was estimated to smoke up to 12 large cigars per day, plus cigarettes in between. Servants were reportedly trained to keep fresh ones ready at all times. A valet once recalled that there were always at least 3 lit cigars on any table Edward occupied. One in his hand, one in waiting, and one forgotten mid-conversation. Doctors, of course, raised alarms. By his late 50s, Edward suffered from chronic bronchitis, recurring throat infections, and periods of breathlessness so intense that ministers had to delay meetings. His physicians noted inflammation in his lungs and damage to his throat lining, but Edward ignored them. He insisted that cigars calmed the nerves and kept him balanced. One physician's note, recovered posthumously, describes Edward as resistant to all counsel regarding his consumption of tobacco, believing moderation an insult to manhood. It wasn't just a physical dependence. It was a performance. The cigar was as much a symbol of status as it was a stimulant. Foreign dignitaries often arrived bearing crates of rare tobacco as gifts. Winston Churchill, still a young MP, once called Edward the only man who could turn a cigar into a diplomatic weapon. It was accurate. The king's cigars had their own itinerary, but the consequences were real. His later years were marked by shallow breathing, fatigue, and worsening heart problems, conditions exacerbated by constant smoking. By the time of his death in 1910, his body was showing the classic symptoms of long-term tobacco abuse. His official cause of death was pneumonia and heart failure. The unofficial cause? A lifetime of slow-burning luxury inhaled by the fistful. Today, Edward's cigar addiction is often used as a historical footnote, evidence of an era when health advice was optional for the powerful. But it's more than that. It represents a monarch who lived entirely in excess: food, sex, smoke, noise. He burned at both ends and puffed in between. Because sometimes royalty doesn't go out with a bang. It just slowly turns to ash, leaving smoke rings where policy should have been. And just behind the curtain of haze was another cloud, a parade of affairs that crossed borders, titles, and moral thresholds. Because even cigars couldn't fill every appetite. 30. Edward VII's endless affairs. Across Europe. If Edward VII had been born a century later, he might have been described not as a monarch, but as a diplomatic liability with a wandering eye. Before ascending the throne, and even more conspicuously afterward, he built a reputation that made entire governments nervous, aristocrats humiliated, and broadsheet publishers exceptionally well-fed. The rumor, persistent, wide-reaching, and utterly undeniable, was that Edward had lovers in nearly every major European city. And not just fleeting flings, affairs, arrangements, entire side lives. The scale of it was what astounded contemporaries. Courtiers whispered that he had at least one mistress in every capital. Hotel ledgers told stories of prolonged stays with anonymous guests. Embassy staff were often reduced to travel agents with benefits. And the most damning sign of all? The silence. Everyone knew, but no one said anything, because almost everyone was implicated. At first, these claims were written off as political slander. Republican pamphlets painted Edward as a lecherous symbol of outdated privilege, a man more concerned with boudoirs than budgets. But over time, private letters, personal diaries, hotel registers, and diplomatic dispatches began to confirm the rumor in granular detail. What had been assumed as exaggerated satire turned into a royal itinerary of romantic entanglement. His most famous liaison was with Alice Keppel, the great-grandmother of Camilla, now queen consort. But she was only one in a long and colorful line. Others included Lily Langtry, the actress turned socialite whose affair with Edward was so open it barely qualified as gossip. In Paris, he was linked with multiple courtesans, some of whom later documented their relationships in memoirs, carefully edited, of course, but remarkably consistent. In Austria, in Spain, in Germany, in Italy, Edward had partners who were wives of diplomats, nobles, entertainers, and occasionally fellow royals. He wasn't discreet. In fact, discretion seemed to offend him. He preferred grand entrances, lavish dinners, and memorable exits. One Parisian noblewoman once described Edward as less of a seducer, more of a gravitational force. People didn't fall for him. They simply failed to escape. This presented a persistent problem for foreign relations. Ambassadors had to smooth over offended husbands. Courtiers had to intercept scandalous letters. Palace aides were instructed to track gifts and jewelry sent across borders to ensure no duplicates arrived at the same duchess's birthday. British consulates unofficially kept lists of Edward's companions to avoid political fallout during his travels. And yet, despite the potential for blackmail or diplomatic disaster, Edward remained largely untouched. Why? Because his charm was as legendary as his appetite. He was disarming, intelligent, and charismatic, able to flatter ministers and mistresses alike. And in an era before paparazzi, plausible deniability was the most powerful tool in the monarchy's arsenal. Still, there were consequences. His behavior undermined Queen Alexandra, whose grace and stoicism became a symbol of patience rather than partnership. It embarrassed Parliament, especially as the rising middle class demanded moral accountability from public figures, and it cemented Edward's image as a king more devoted to pleasure than policy. Today, historians don't dispute the affairs. They count them. And not out of salacious curiosity, but because the sheer volume speaks to something deeper. A monarch unmoored by duty, filling a void with admiration, intimacy, and escape. Because when the crown weighs too heavily, some kings seek comfort not in solitude, but in the arms of strangers. And in the tangled aftermath of all those affairs, a quieter war was waged. One fought not in beds or ballrooms, but in icy glances across breakfast tables. 31. Queen Alexandra. Quietly feuding with Edward VII's mistresses. Publicly, Queen Alexandra was the picture of Victorian elegance, serene, dignified, and endlessly composed. Privately, she was a woman married to a man whose definition of discretion was printing his schedule in the society pages and hoping no one noticed the extra hotel suite. The rumor, repeated in whispers for decades, was that Alexandra waged a cold and quiet feud with her husband's many mistresses, a war of silences, gestures, and strategic distance. No confrontations, no scandalous public outbursts, just a slow-burning frost that could chill a room before she even entered it. To outsiders, it looked like grace under pressure, but to those inside the royal household, the temperature was unmistakable. Queen Alexandra didn't scream, she withdrew. She didn't protest, she outlasted. She wielded social exclusion like a sword and non-recognition like a verdict. One of her primary targets was Alice Keppel, Edward's final and most prominent mistress. While Alexandra never spoke of her directly, those in court noted that Keppel was pointedly excluded from certain events, even when other courtiers insisted on her presence due to Edward's demands. If Keppel entered a room, Alexandra left. If she remained seated at dinner, Alexandra would sometimes change her seat, or cancel her appearance entirely. Letters from the royal household staff reveal a careful orchestration behind the scenes, duplicate guest lists, separate entrances, and last-minute reshuffling to avoid social collisions. A chambermaid once wrote that it was like managing two monarchs with opposing weather systems. Alexandra's disdain was quiet, but so precisely administered that Keppel was never in doubt of her station, tolerated but not accepted. And it wasn't just Keppel. Alexandra reportedly kept a mental ledger of Edward's other indiscretions, particularly those who attempted to secure social standing from their associations. She had no patience for women who paraded their access to the king like a prize. Those who knew their place, who disappeared when required, were ignored. Those who didn't were quietly removed from the social ladder, rung by rung. What made Alexandra's strategy so effective was her silence. She never gave anyone material to use against her. There were no quotes, no letters of protest, no confrontations overheard behind drapes. She simply endured, and by enduring, she forced the court to choose between novelty and legacy. And they chose her, because Alexandra was the queen. And in time, she became more beloved than her husband, especially after his death. The public remembered her composure. The aristocracy remembered her steel. Even Keppel, in her later years, reportedly confessed that the Queen's silent treatment had been more wounding than any shouting match could have been. Historians today recognize Alexandra's quiet feud not as passive aggression, but as strategic resilience. She couldn't control her husband, but she could control the court. And in doing so, she preserved the dignity of a crown constantly at risk of being soiled by its own wearer. Because in a palace filled with whispers and velvet shadows, sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that never raises itself. And sometimes, the most devastating feud isn't the one that explodes, but the one that freezes you out. 32. George V, allowing his physician to hasten his death. It was the final whispered indignity of a reign defined by restraint, that King George V, the stiff-lipped symbol of wartime endurance and royal discipline, had his death quietly expedited by his own doctor, not with malice, not with vengeance, but with timing, politically sensitive, carefully managed, and above all, off the official record. For decades, the story sounded like macabre court gossip, that the king hadn't died naturally, but had been nudged into the grave for the sake of the morning headlines. As rumors go, it had all the right ingredients: a dying monarch, a loyal physician, a family with political pressures, and, most importantly, a press schedule. George V had been in declining health for months before his death in January 1936. Years of heavy smoking had left his lungs in ruin, and he was often confined to bed, suffering from chronic bronchitis and circulatory problems. Yet he was still the king, and his very existence, ill or not, remained central to the image of national stability during a time of growing international unrest. By early January, he was fading fast. The court prepared for the end. Newspapers waited for official word. The country held its breath. And then came the moment. On January 20th, 1936, just before midnight, the king died at Sandringham House. But the real story, buried for nearly 50 years, came not from courtiers or political advisors, but from the king's physician himself. In 1986, a private diary kept by Lord Dawson of Penn, George V's attending doctor, was made public. Inside it was a calmly written, damning revelation. Dawson had not merely comforted the king in his final hours. He had taken matters into his own hands. The entry detailed how, with the king slipping into unconsciousness and death inevitable, Dawson administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine to ensure that death came swiftly, and crucially before midnight, so that the king's passing could appear in the next morning's edition of the Times. The motivation? Optics, dignity, public perception. According to Dawson's own words, it was done in the best interests of the country. He believed that a dignified death, properly timed, would prevent the undignified spectacle of a lingering decline leaking out through tabloids and speculation. And by acting when he did, He allowed the government and the royal family to control the message, announcing the death with composure, authority, and precision. The reaction when this diary entry was released was swift and stunned. Royal officials downplayed it. Medical ethicists raised eyebrows. Historians were divided. Was it mercy? Was it murder? Was it, as Dawson implied, simply the final act of royal management? Importantly, this wasn't euthanasia by request. There is no indication that George V asked for his life to be shortened, nor did his family give permission. Dawson acted unilaterally based on what he believed was best, and that perhaps is what made the rumor so disturbing, and ultimately so memorable. For decades, the British monarchy had been built on the illusion of eternal continuity. Kings don't die suddenly. They pass on, serenely, draped in velvet and legacy. What Dawson's diary revealed was something far more modern and far more human. That even death, in the monarchy, is stage-managed. Today, the incident is considered one of the most quietly shocking royal revelations of the 20th century. Not because of its brutality, it wasn't, but because of what it revealed about how far even the most traditional institutions will go to protect the illusion of control. The king's body may have been failing, but the monarchy's narrative had to remain intact. And if that meant one final injection to keep the story tidy, so be it. Because in the end, even kings are subject to the news cycle. And as this king was gently ushered into silence, his sons, left behind, carried more than the crown. They carried the scars of what it meant to be raised under his rule. 33. George V, violently disciplining his sons. The image of George V that most people remember is that of a stern but steady patriarch, a symbol of imperial endurance with a face carved from Edwardian stone. But behind the tightly trimmed beard and stiff military uniform was another legacy, whispered between the walls of royal nurseries and scrawled into private letters, that the king was not just strict, but physically severe with his sons. The rumor, long considered uncomfortable and possibly exaggerated, was that George V ruled his household with an iron rod, and that his sons bore the weight of that rule in more ways than one. To understand the roots of this rumor, one must understand George himself. He was a product of a militarized, hierarchical world where emotion was weakness and obedience was the highest virtue. His own childhood had been no sun-dappled idyll. His father, Edward VII, rarely showed affection, and George was sent into the Navy as a teenager, where he learned that discipline was not just expected, it was survival. He emerged not softened by service, but hardened by it. That hardness followed him into fatherhood. George and Queen Mary had 6 children. 2 of them, Edward, later Edward VIII, and Albert, later George VI, would inherit the throne in drastically different circumstances. Both would, in later writings and recollections, suggest that their father's discipline had crossed a line, not merely into coldness, but into something far more punishing. Edward VIII, in his memoirs, described his childhood as one marked by terror rather than warmth. He noted that he and his siblings lived in constant fear of their father's presence, and he referred to George as a man of immediate judgment and no patience. He claimed that affection was doled out sparingly, and that any deviation from 33. George V, violently disciplining his sons. The image of George V that most people remember is that of a stern but steady patriarch, a symbol of imperial endurance with a face carved from Edwardian stone. But behind the tightly trimmed beard and stiff military uniform was another legacy, whispered between the walls of royal nurseries and scrawled into private letters, that the king was not just strict, but physically severe with his sons. The rumor, long considered uncomfortable and possibly exaggerated, was that George V ruled his household with an iron rod, and that his sons bore the weight of that rule in more ways than one. To understand the roots of this rumor, one must understand George himself. He was a product of a militarized, hierarchical world where emotion was weakness and obedience was the highest virtue. His own childhood had been no sun-dappled idyll. His father, Edward VII, rarely showed affection, and George was sent into the Navy as a teenager, where he learned that discipline was not just expected, it was survival. He emerged not softened by service, but hardened by it. That hardness followed him into fatherhood. George and Queen Mary had 6 children. 2 of them, Edward, later Edward VIII, and Albert, later George VI, would inherit the throne in drastically different circumstances. Both would, in later writings and recollections, suggest that their father's discipline had crossed a line, not merely into coldness, but into something far more punishing. Edward VIII, in his memoirs, described his childhood as one marked by terror rather than warmth. He noted that he and his siblings lived in constant fear of their father's presence, and he referred to George as a man of immediate judgment and no patience. He claimed that affection was doled out sparingly, and that any deviation from proper behavior was met not with correction, but punishment. Letters between royal tutors and household staff reinforced this impression. George demanded absolute obedience, and when his children fell short, the response could be sudden and physically forceful. Slaps, shouting, abrupt removals from family events. These incidents weren't just occasional, they were systemic. The children were raised in a climate of performance, where any perceived failure was corrected not with conversation, but with reprimand, often in front of others. George VI, the younger son who would eventually wear the crown after his brother abdicated, internalized this legacy more quietly. He suffered from a debilitating stammer, something modern psychology. 34. Edward VIII. Leaking state secrets to foreign powers. When Edward VIII became king in 1936, Britain collectively held its breath, not with awe, but with uncertainty. He was glamorous, modern, camera-friendly. He was also impulsive, emotionally erratic, and famously allergic to responsibility. Behind the flashbulbs and public smiles, a quieter and far more dangerous rumor followed him throughout his short-lived reign, that Edward, in his years as Prince of Wales and even as king, had leaked sensitive state secrets to foreign governments, not through espionage, not through ideological betrayal, but through sheer reckless indiscretion. For decades, this rumor was confined to diplomatic corridors and intelligence circles. Edward was known to be careless with information, loose-lipped with foreign dignitaries, and frustratingly naive about the importance of secrecy. But that was all hearsay, until the archives opened. The truth began to emerge in the 1950s, and by the early 2000s, declassified files from MI5, MI6, and various foreign intelligence agencies confirmed what had long been whispered. Edward VIII had, in fact, passed on privileged information during private conversations with German, Italian, and even Soviet representatives, sometimes under the illusion of personal diplomacy, and sometimes simply to appear important. In one infamous example, Edward is believed to have shared details of British defense strategy and the vulnerability of the French border with a high-ranking German official in the early 1930s. His intention, according to post-war intelligence files, was not treachery, but vanity. He wanted to be seen as a statesman, someone in the know, someone powerful. But the effect was the same. That information made its way to Nazi intelligence and was later used to inform Germany's strategy during the early years of the war. Diplomatic correspondence between British embassies in Europe revealed that Edward's private conversations had become a matter of concern well before he became king. He spoke freely about cabinet discussions, revealed who disliked whom within government, and occasionally gave away timelines of British foreign policy decisions. To Edward, it was gossip. To everyone else, it was a national security risk. And yet, he was never punished. Why? Because he was the heir, and then the monarch, and the establishment as ever prized appearance over accountability. After his abdication, things got worse. As the Duke of Windsor, Edward continued to court favor with Nazi officials during his travels in Europe. Declassified FBI and MI5 files describe meetings between Edward and German representatives as late as 1940, where he was still viewed as a potential ally, especially if Britain fell to invasion and a puppet monarchy was required. One German memo described Edward as friendly to German interests and skeptical of the present British leadership. Even Winston Churchill, who had previously defended Edward during the abdication crisis, was later appalled by the extent of his indiscretion. Private letters suggest Churchill considered placing Edward under surveillance, and possibly even under house arrest, during the war. The only reason he wasn't was the fear of scandal. So yes, the rumor was true. Edward VIII had leaked state secrets, not as a spy, but as a man more concerned with his own ego than his country's stability. And while Britain would never charge a former king with treason, history has delivered its own quiet indictment. Because when a crown is placed on the head of a man who values flattery over duty, the real power lies not in what he says, but in what he can't keep to himself. And what he did say in private was sometimes even uglier than what he let slip in staterooms. 35. Edward VIII. Mocking disabled people privately. Even before he became king, Edward VIII cultivated a reputation for charm. Thin charm, but potent. He was handsome, witty, and unburdened by the heavy gravitas of his father, George V. To the public, he seemed modern, relatable, a prince for the people. But inside the palace walls, another Edward emerged, one with a sharp tongue and a streak of cruelty that those closest to him remembered long after the crown was set aside. The most persistent and disturbing rumor was that Edward had a habit of mocking people with disabilities, that he joked about their appearances, imitated their mannerisms, and made callous remarks in private settings where, he believed, his words would never leave the room. This was more than a single anecdote. It was a pattern, repeated across memoirs, interviews, and servant recollections. Over time, the story hardened into fact. Staff who worked with Edward during his years as Prince of Wales, and later as the Duke of Windsor, recalled his tendency to ridicule individuals he considered weak or embarrassing. One former footman, interviewed in the 1970s, described an incident where Edward made fun of a wounded veteran at a charity event, imitating the man's gait behind his back after shaking his hand. The staff was mortified. Edward, they claimed, simply laughed and moved on. Another example came from the memoirs of Sir Alan Lascelles, Edward's former private secretary. While Lascelles was discreet, he made several pointed references to the Duke's lack of empathy and habit of using jest as a knife. Others, including close relatives and aides, mentioned Edward's tendency to refer to individuals with visible disabilities using cruel nicknames. These were not wartime generals hardened by callous speech. They were personal staff, nurses, and charity recipients. Perhaps most telling was Edward's strained relationship with the wider Bowes-Lyon family, relatives of his sister-in-law, Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother. Years later, when it was revealed that two of her cousins had been institutionalized due to developmental disabilities, Edward reportedly dismissed them as non-entities in a private letter, with a tone that biographers later described as shockingly flippant. To those around him, Edward's cruelty seemed casual rather than ideological. He wasn't ranting. He was snickering. His comments weren't speeches. They were barbs. And somehow, that made it worse. There was no agenda, just a lack of empathy. Why does this matter? Because Edward VIII wasn't just a public figure. For a time, he was Britain's symbolic head of state, the personification of unity and leadership. And when the person behind that image mocks those most vulnerable, it isn't just a private failing. It's a crack in the very institution he represents. Historians now accept that Edward's private remarks were not outliers. They were consistent with his character. A man raised in privilege, insulated from consequence, and incapable of recognizing the dignity of others unless it benefited him. Because for all his glamour, Edward never saw power as responsibility. He saw it as a mirror. And in that mirror, there was room only for himself. But his reflections didn't stop there. They cast a long shadow, one that aligned disturbingly well with another persistent, long-denied rumor. A friendship that turned stomachs, a sympathy that crossed a line. 36. Edward VIII's Nazi sympathies. For a man who abdicated the throne for love, Edward VIII spent the rest of his life trying to convince the world that he'd merely followed his heart. What he didn't advertise, what the royal family long tried to keep under wraps, was the darker alignment behind his exile. The persistent, deeply disturbing rumor that Edward had Nazi sympathies, that he admired Hitler, that he believed fascism was the future, and that, had history unfolded slightly differently, he might have returned to Britain, not as king, but as puppet. For decades, this claim was dismissed as political mudslinging. Edward had been forced out, the argument went, and his enemies, especially those within the British government, had every reason to smear him. After all, wasn't he just a charming rogue with poor judgment? A man drawn to style, not ideology? But when intelligence files began to be declassified in the late 20th century, the rumor hardened into something else. An incontrovertible fact, thoroughly documented and morally damning. The most telling evidence comes from the so-called Marburg files, a trove of captured German documents discovered after World War II, which included memoranda, diplomatic cables, and correspondence involving the former king. Among them was a report detailing a meeting between Edward and a German diplomat in 1937, in which Edward allegedly expressed the view that the bombing of British cities might force the government into peace negotiations. Another German document states plainly that Edward believed a continued war would destroy the British Empire, and that Hitler was the only man who could save Europe from communism. And then there were the photographs. In 1937, less than a year after abdicating, Edward and Wallace Simpson visited Germany, greeted by Nazi officials with full ceremonial fanfare. There is footage of the Duke and Duchess touring German industry, inspecting Nazi youth parades, and, most infamously, meeting Adolf Hitler at his Bavarian retreat. Edward is seen smiling, nodding, chatting. Wallace appears just as at ease. The British press, under heavy influence from the government, suppressed most of these images at the time. But the foreign press did not. European newspapers ran them openly, and the public began to ask, why was the former king fraternizing with the Third Reich? The answer, according to diplomatic correspondence and surveillance reports, was simple. He believed fascism was a valid alternative to democracy. He said so repeatedly. Churchill, once a supporter of Edward's right to marry Wallace, became deeply alarmed by his post-abdication activities. During the war, Edward was sent to the Bahamas as governor, a role deliberately chosen to keep him far from Europe and far from influence. MI5 and MI6 both monitored his communications. Some in British intelligence believed that if Germany had successfully invaded Britain, Edward would have been installed as a Nazi-friendly monarch, willing, or at least compliant. Even after the war, Edward never truly renounced his views. He maintained that Hitler had been misunderstood early on, and privately expressed frustration at how he'd been treated by the British government. He believed he'd been exiled not for his politics, but for daring to love the wrong woman. But the documents tell a different story. He wasn't just careless with diplomacy, he was sympathetic to fascism. Not strategically, but ideologically. Today, historians agree, Edward VIII was a security threat. His sympathies weren't fleeting. They were foundational, and his removal from power was not only constitutional necessity, it was national self-preservation. Because sometimes the greatest danger to a country doesn't come from foreign enemies. It comes from within, from a crown worn by a man who mistakes tyranny for strength. And once a king starts plotting against his own leaders, the next rumor writes itself. Betrayal is never far behind. 37. Edward VIII. Wanting Churchill removed. If Edward VIII's fondness for Nazi Germany was an open secret by mid-century, the idea that he had actively tried to remove Winston Churchill from power was a far murkier, far more dangerous whisper. At first, it sounded like retroactive fiction, something invented to spice up an already tumultuous period. But over time, documents emerged, and what they revealed was something far less dramatic than a coup and far more insidious. The rumor, persistent since the 1940s, was that Edward, by then Duke of Windsor, harbored a deep personal resentment toward Churchill, and not just because Churchill had helped maneuver him off the throne. The claim was that Edward actively conspired, or at least lobbied foreign powers, to have Churchill removed from office during World War II, that he believed Churchill was unfit to lead, and worse, that he said so to Britain's enemies. To understand the gravity of this, one must return to 1940. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France had fallen. The Blitz had begun, and Churchill, newly installed as Prime Minister, was the last barrier between Britain and capitulation. During this moment, this precise historical heartbeat, Edward was living in exile, stewing in resentment, and, according to intelligence reports, writing letters. The Marburg files, again, serve as the damning source. In them, German officials record communications from Edward in which he criticizes Churchill's leadership in sharply personal terms. He allegedly referred to Churchill as a drunk and unstable, and suggested that peace negotiations with Germany should be seriously considered, terms Churchill had categorically ruled out. Most damningly, Edward is reported to have told a German envoy that the removal of Churchill would be the first step toward peace in Europe. These were not idle words. They were recorded by German diplomats, relayed back to Berlin, and viewed as a potential strategic foothold. Hitler believed Edward could be useful, not only as a possible puppet monarch, but as someone who might encourage dissent within British ranks. The British government, upon learning of this, panicked quietly. Churchill, while never officially acknowledging the Duke's activities during the war, worked behind the scenes to keep him isolated. It was no accident that Edward's role as governor of the Bahamas, an island post with virtually no influence, was enforced with such urgency. It was exile, dressed as duty, and the resentment lingered. Letters between Edward and his allies contain veiled references to Churchill as the bulldog they dare not leash and the last Victorian illusion. Edward clearly saw Churchill not just as a political enemy, but as the man who had personally destroyed his legacy. Today, historians walk a delicate line when interpreting this part of the Windsor file. Edward did not orchestrate a coup. He did not openly commit treason, but he undermined Churchill's leadership during Britain's most vulnerable moment, and he did so while enjoying the comforts of royal privilege. It wasn't just betrayal, it was entitlement with a fountain pen. Because for all his rhetoric about duty and fairness, Edward VIII never quite accepted that he wasn't the hero of the story. And behind every frustrated letter was another rumor waiting to bloom about the woman he loved and how she too had her hands in the machinery of power. 38. Wallis Simpson. Manipulating the king. If Edward VIII was the reckless match that nearly burned down the monarchy, Wallis Simpson was the kindling people had been warning about for years. From the moment her name entered the public domain, she was branded with every label British high society had for a woman who knew her own mind: schemer, seductress, interloper, foreigner, divorcee. But underneath all that scandalous shorthand was a deeper, more persistent rumor, one that not even the most devout defenders of the abdicated king could ever fully dismiss. That Wallis Simpson hadn't simply influenced Edward. She had controlled him. This was not a new narrative. Even during their courtship, before the constitutional crisis, before the throne trembled, Wallis was said to have held an uncanny power over the Prince of Wales. Court insiders whispered that he hung on her every word, sought her approval before making even the smallest decisions, and seemed incapable of functioning without her emotional affirmation. Friends who visited the couple reported being stunned by Edward's near-obsessive devotion, offering to fetch her drinks, rearrange furniture for her comfort, even change his travel schedule to accommodate her whims. But it wasn't just the emotional dependence that raised eyebrows, it was how Wallace used it. In newly released correspondence and diplomatic documents, especially those unearthed from the Marburg files and later explored by historians, Wallace appears not just as a companion, but as an operator. She communicated directly with foreign officials, sometimes bypassing Edward entirely, sometimes speaking as though on his behalf. She offered political opinions. She weighed in on appointments. She expressed preferences that Edward then seemed to adopt as his own. One British diplomat, writing confidentially in 1936, noted, "His Majesty seems less a sovereign than an echo." Another warned that Wallace was accustomed to handling powerful men and does not see the crown as immune to her direction. None of this is to suggest that Wallace orchestrated Edward's abdication or his flirtations with fascism. But what emerges clearly is a portrait of a man whose autonomy was slipping, and a woman who knew how to fill the void. Even the royal family began to fear her influence. Queen Mary, Edward's mother, referred to Wallace in letters as "that woman" and refused to meet her. George VI, Edward's younger brother and successor, maintained strict boundaries between his own family and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, reportedly citing Wallace's interference as one of the reasons. To the institution of monarchy, she represented not merely scandal, but erosion. A steady whittling down of the king's independence. And yet, Wallis Simpson was not some villainous caricature. In many ways, she was also a survivor, an American woman navigating the brutal hierarchies of British aristocracy, demonized for daring to inhabit a space no one wanted her in. She had no real power, no title until after Edward abdicated, and no protection against the tidal wave of blame hurled in her direction. She lived her life in exile, surrounded by wealth but haunted by rejection. But the rumors, those sharp, persistent things, still had teeth, and modern historians, with the benefit of access and distance, generally agree. Wallis didn't just advise Edward. She shaped him, molded him, shielded him from reality and, occasionally, from himself. Because when a man surrenders his throne for a woman, history writes it as romance. But when that woman begins speaking with his voice and making decisions in his name, the line between love and manipulation blurs, and the crown remembers who wore the trousers. And just when the monarchy thought it had recovered from the mess of abdication, a new, quieter scandal was quietly institutionalized, one that lived not in palaces, but in forgotten hospital rooms hidden behind locked doors and false death certificates. 39. Queen Mother. Hiding disabled Bose Lion relatives. For a family whose very survival depends on managing public perception, the British royals have long practiced a delicate form of erasure. But few acts of concealment are as quietly cruel or as haunting as the fate of Nerissa and Catherine Bose Lion, the long-rumored, long-forgotten cousins of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The story that circulated for decades was simple and appalling, that the Queen Mother had hidden away two of her nieces, daughters of her brother John Bose Lion, because they were born with severe developmental disabilities. That these women had been quietly institutionalized, declared dead on paper, and left to rot in obscurity while their cousins ascended to Buckingham Palace. For years it was treated as either anti-monarchist slander or ghoulish exaggeration. After all, how could such a thing be done and no one notice? But then, in 1987, a reporter for The Sun uncovered something shocking. Both women were alive, still living in the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Redhill, a Victorian-era asylum known more for warehousing than care. Their records showed they had been institutionalized since childhood. Nerissa had been born in 1919, Catherine in 1926. Both were registered as having severe cognitive impairments. They were admitted to the hospital in 1941, and then forgotten. Well, not entirely. Someone had declared them legally dead in Burke's Peerage, the Bible of aristocratic bloodlines. The entry claimed Nerissa died in 1940 and Catherine in 1961. The family signed off on it. Gravestones were erected. Empty. It wasn't a mistake. It was a whitewashing. The revelation caused a minor public scandal. The palace remained silent, offering the usual line that this was a private family matter. But the timing couldn't have been worse. Britain in the 1980s was no longer reverent. The monarchy was already under pressure. And here was evidence that its own extended family had practiced a kind of genetic embarrassment, literally locking away what didn't fit the royal mold. Nurses at the institution later gave interviews. They described the sisters as nonverbal but affectionate, capable of basic interaction, and prone to excitement when watching royal events on television, particularly coronations. They were said to have no idea that they were related to the Queen. Historians remain divided over how much the Queen Mother personally knew. Some suggest she was fully aware and made the decision for what she believed was the dignity of the family. Others argue it was a collective choice, reflecting the deeply entrenched stigma toward disability in upper-class Britain at the time. But whatever the motive, the effect was chilling. Nerissa died in 1986, buried in a pauper's grave marked with plastic tags. Catherine survived until 2014, outliving nearly everyone who tried to erase her. And so, the rumor was true. Two royal relatives were hidden, institutionalized, declared dead, and written out of history, because their existence made the family uncomfortable. Because when your dynasty is built on the illusion of divine perfection, even your own blood can become an inconvenience. And when that blood spills into gambling debts and racing stables, the erasure takes a different form, indulgence dressed as philanthropy. 40. Queen Mother's gambling addiction. Publicly, the Queen Mother was affectionately portrayed as a charming relic of wartime Britain, a teacup-wielding symbol of continuity who embodied grace under pressure. Privately, she was something else entirely. Razor-sharp, iron-willed, and deeply committed to her own creature comforts. Chief among them, gambling. For years, rumors circulated that the Queen Mother was not merely fond of betting on horses but absolutely addicted to it. Friends joked that she had a standing line to the bookies. Courtiers rolled their eyes at her racing calendar, which she treated more seriously than foreign affairs. But underneath the aristocratic laughter was a growing unease, that the Queen Mother's love of racing had become an expensive, near-compulsive habit. It wasn't just that she liked to flutter, it was that she gambled a lot. The truth emerged slowly, in memoirs, financial ledgers, and personal letters that found their way into the public domain over the years. Royal finance experts and biographers began noting strange anomalies in the royal household accounts. Odd surges in spending tied to race seasons, unexplained cash withdrawals from her personal staff budgets, and donations to obscure racing syndicates. Journalist Michael Thornton, in his biography of the Queen Mother, revealed that her racing debts often ran into the hundreds of thousands. At one point, a private banker confided that the Queen Mother owed more than a cabinet minister would feel comfortable discussing. And this wasn't an isolated moment. It was a long-running pattern. She kept multiple racing advisors on staff. She received detailed reports about every horse she had a stake in. Her staff coordinated her schedule around major race days, especially Royal Ascot, where she held court like a seasoned general in a campaign tent. To her credit, she didn't hide it. She made jokes about her flutter, but the scale of her involvement was no joke. When her overdrafts ballooned in the 1990s, the royal household quietly arranged for them to be covered. Some say using part of the civil list funds, others suggest personal donations from her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. But perhaps the most telling insight comes from a former courtier who once said, "Her Majesty saw betting not as a vice, but as a patriotic duty." The logic? British racing supported British tradition. The Queen Mother, in her mind, was just preserving culture. With a betting slip. Historians now view her gambling as part of a broader pattern among Britain's aristocracy. an inherited belief that personal indulgence was a private matter, no matter how large the cost. And when you're the queen mother, the cost is always absorbed by the system, by the staff, by the silence. Because when royalty bets the house, someone else always pays the mortgage. And just beyond the racecourse was another palace, where the queen's sister, bored and brilliant, began setting fires of her own. 41. Princess Margaret's heavy drinking. Long before royal misbehavior was fodder for social media, Princess Margaret was already perfecting the art of the aristocratic spiral. Glamorous, defiant, and fiercely intelligent, she became the monarchy's most complicated character, always in the frame, never quite on script. And at the heart of her offstage persona was a rumor that followed her from the swinging 60s into her lonely later years, that she drank too much, not as a social indulgence, but as a daily routine, a dependency, an unspoken crisis. For years this was whispered about in elite circles, dismissed by some as class-based exaggeration or as misogynistic hand-wringing over a woman who didn't conform. But then came the memoirs, the medical documents, and the testimonials from staff. The picture that emerged was not of a party girl, but of someone slowly drowning in privilege. Margaret's daily routine, according to her former staff and several royal biographies, followed a near ritualistic pattern. Breakfast, served in bed at around 11 o'clock, was accompanied by a pick-me-up that frequently involved gin or wine. By lunchtime, she was on to scotch. By evening, it was champagne or port. This wasn't occasional celebration. It was structure. A timetable of quiet unraveling. Her lunches often began with at least one strong cocktail. Dinners were long, wine-soaked affairs. She wasn't usually drunk in the messy, theatrical sense, but dulled, softened, slipping slightly behind the edge of alertness. Doctors in the latter half of her life began to express concerns. She suffered a series of strokes in the 1990s and early 2000s. Many of which were quietly attributed by insiders to years of drinking and smoking. Her mobility declined. Her public appearances became less frequent. Her sharp tongue remained, but the physical toll was visible. And yet, the palace never acknowledged any of it. Officially, Margaret remained in good spirits or resting comfortably. The reality, behind the scenes, was that staff had to schedule her days around her ability to function, and her ability to face the press without visible symptoms. One former nurse described Margaret as deeply lonely and tired of being the disappointment. Another friend said that the drinking wasn't about rebellion, it was about escape. She lived a half-life, neither free nor bound. Modern observers now view Margaret's drinking not as a personal failure, but as a structural tragedy. The product of being born second in a system that only rewards firsts. She had no role, no real authority, and no freedom. Just enough spotlight to burn, but never enough to shine. Because when royalty can't speak freely, they drink quietly. And when the palace won't listen, the glass becomes the only thing that echoes back. 42. Princess Margaret's chain smoking. By the time Princess Margaret was lighting her first cigarette of the day, her sister was already knee-deep in red boxes, parliamentary briefings, and ceremonial bows. The contrast wasn't just symbolic, it was structural. One sister ruled, the other rebelled. But while the tabloids pounced on Margaret's romantic scandals and party girl reputation, a quieter, more persistent rumor drifted through the corridors of Kensington Palace like a cloud of Dunhill smoke, that Princess Margaret was a chain smoker, relentlessly, habitually, and destructively so. It wasn't just rumor, it was ambient reality. Margaret's love affair with cigarettes started early, long before she was old enough to understand the irony of poisoning royal lungs while upholding royal dignity. She began smoking in her teens, possibly as early as age 15, when being seen with a cigarette was considered both glamorous and rebellious. By the time she reached adulthood, the cigarette had become not just a habit, but a fixture. It was her accessory, her punctuation mark, her punctuation itself. Friends recalled how Margaret could rarely be found without a lit cigarette in hand, whether during official dinners, private holidays, or casual conversations at home. She smoked through interviews, hair appointments, rehearsals for charity events, and even during her infamous breakfast-in-bed marathons. Waitstaff learned to anticipate her needs not with tea or toast, but with fresh ashtrays. Designers tailored her dresses to allow for discreet stashing. It was said that if you couldn't find the princess, just follow the scent of Dior perfume and smoke. For years, this was treated as a stylish quirk, a mark of the monarchy's only modern royal. But by the 1970s, even as public attitudes toward smoking shifted, Margaret didn't. She smoked heavily, sometimes more than 30 cigarettes a day. Doctors warned her repeatedly, particularly as she aged and her health began to decline. But Margaret, ever defiant, saw medical warnings as intrusive and unseemly. By the 1990s, the effects were impossible to hide. Margaret suffered chronic lung issues. She developed a persistent cough that alarmed even the most hardened palace aides. But still, the smoking continued. She reportedly told one physician, "I'd rather die of smoke than boredom." It was a quip that sounded amusing at first, until it stopped being funny. In 1998, Margaret suffered a mild stroke, followed by a series of more serious ones in the early 2000s. While her drinking certainly played a role, so did the decades of smoking. Her mobility declined rapidly. Her vision was affected. She was photographed less and less, and when she was, the vibrant rebel of the 1960s seemed replaced by someone thinner, wearier, and encased in silent damage. Hospital records later confirmed that Margaret was treated for chronic bronchitis and other smoking-related complications. At her funeral in 2002, not a single official statement acknowledged the role cigarettes played in her decline, but those who knew her understood. The smoke that had once made her seem dangerous and untouchable had, in the end, simply smothered her. The palace never commented, because that's how the monarchy handles slow-motion disasters, with silence and stately wreaths. Margaret's ashes were laid to rest beside her father's in St. George's Chapel, and the scandal of her smoking drifted away like the last puff of a cigarette flicked into palace gravel. But what lingered, what always lingered, was the way she treated those beneath her, especially the people paid to keep her functioning. And that trail of damage didn't vanish. It gave birth to the next set of whispers. 43. Princess Margaret's cruel comments to staff. Princess Margaret may have inherited her mother's sharp cheekbones, but she took the Queen Mother's steely detachment and sharpened it into a weapon. Behind the tiaras and social whirl, a different rumor followed Margaret through the decades, that she was, in private, cuttingly cruel to her staff. Not with rage, not with tantrums, but with casual, aristocratic contempt. It began as offhand stories, maids who left in tears, valets who refused reassignment, cooks who requested transfers. In an institution already infamous for stiff hierarchies and impossible standards, Margaret stood out as especially difficult. She had exacting expectations, rigid schedules, and very little patience for perceived incompetence. Multiple memoirs written by former royal staff have included anecdotes about Margaret's behavior. In one account, a housemaid remembered being told never to speak unless spoken to, and certainly never to address the princess without using her full title. Another recalled being scolded for leaving a glass half an inch out of alignment on a bedside table. Margaret allegedly told the woman, "I don't pay you to improvise." She is said to have once told a new footman, "I don't need you to think, I need you to open the door." It was a line repeated over the years by various staffers, almost like a grim joke. Her reputation wasn't as explosive as her grandfather George V, nor as scandalous as her great-uncle Edward VIII, but she was feared in her own way. Icy. Unapologetic. Performative in her power. Staff were reportedly required to stand whenever she entered a room, even in informal settings. They could not begin meals until she had taken her first bite. They were expected to anticipate her moods, preferences, and social temperature on a day-by-day basis. Failure to do so might result in a look, a comment, or worse, complete dismissal. Journalists who visited her in semi-private capacities during her later life were often stunned by the atmosphere of servitude. One BBC producer who arranged a documentary in the 1980s described it as like entering Versailles, but with less warmth. And yet there was complexity there too. Friends insist that Margaret could be warm, even maternal, to staff she truly trusted. A select few recalled her showing surprising generosity, quiet bonuses, handwritten notes of thanks, and sudden moments of kindness. But it was always selective. She didn't warm easily, and if you crossed her, even accidentally, you were frozen out. Biographers argue that Margaret's behavior wasn't just personal temperament. It was the inevitable product of a woman trapped between privilege and impotence. She had no real power in state matters, so she exerted total power where she could, at home, over people, over details, over control. Because if you grow up knowing you'll never rule, but still have to act royal, your throne becomes your temper. And when the palace lights dimmed on her, it became clear. Margaret never really escaped the role she was given, or the bitter edges it carved into her. 44. Prince Philip's racist jokes. To some, Prince Philip was the lovable, straight-talking royal consort, the only man in the world who could get away with teasing the Queen. To others, he was the human embodiment of a raised eyebrow, an artifact of a bygone age who said what everyone else had the tact not to. But throughout his life, one rumor refused to die: that Prince Philip routinely made offensive comments, particularly racially charged jokes, in both public and private. And that they weren't one-offs, they were a pattern. The public heard them first in the 1980s, when Philip's remarks during royal tours became too obvious to ignore. At a factory in Scotland, he asked a group of Asian employees if they were still making chopsticks. In China, he told British students, "If you stay here much longer, you'll go home with slitty eyes." In Kenya, he referred to local people as slightly slitty-eyed. In Papua New Guinea, he asked, "You managed not to get eaten then?" It became a running joke for journalists, and a problem for Buckingham Palace. At first, the palace tried to laugh it off. Philip was described as old school, blunt, or unfiltered. But behind the scenes, the royal press office was in permanent damage control. Entire tour briefings were rewritten to avoid risky situations. Staff were told to prep local dignitaries with polite warnings. Don't take it personally. But it wasn't just public remarks. Former palace aides have said Philip often made offhand comments that, while not always malicious, revealed an attitude frozen in the worldview of a 1940s naval officer. He made national stereotypes into punchlines. He seemed baffled by changing social norms. And crucially, he didn't stop. Even as other royals evolved their language, Philip doubled down. His defenders called it charm. His critics called it ignorance dressed as mischief. The truth? It was both. Philip often used humor as armor, especially in uncomfortable settings. He was allergic to sincerity, but intent doesn't erase impact. His words left real offense, particularly in Commonwealth nations that were already grappling with the British Empire's legacy. By the 2000s, the media had stopped calling them gaffes and started calling them what they were: a liability. The royal brand had changed. Philip hadn't. When asked later in life about his remarks, he seemed unbothered. "I can't change," he once said. "I don't see why I should." And that perhaps was the most revealing quote of all. Because in a family obsessed with adapting to survive, Philip never adapted. He endured, loudly, bluntly, and often offensively. The monarchy tried to keep him in check, but he had already become the punchline they could never take back. 45. Prince Philip's harsh treatment of Charles. In public, they were the picture of tradition, A stately, distant father and a sensitive, awkward son. Prince Philip, all jawlines and barking orders, a product of war and duty. Prince Charles, quiet, introspective, and constantly on the verge of either blushing or apologizing. For decades, the royal PR machine portrayed their relationship as complicated in that polite, evasive way the palace uses to mean not good. But behind that stiff upper lip was a quieter, more painful truth, long rumored, reluctantly confirmed, and quietly devastating. Prince Philip was hard on Charles, relentlessly so. From Charles's earliest years, he never quite fit the Windsor mold. Where Philip had been forged in the brutal structure of military schools in exile, Charles was reflective, bookish, and overly sensitive by his father's standards. That difference wasn't just noted, it was punished. Biographers, former tutors, and even Charles himself have repeatedly confirmed that Philip treated his eldest son not with warmth, but with a cold, corrective authority. It began with schooling. Philip insisted Charles attend Gordonstoun, his own brutal Scottish alma mater, an institution known for its rigid discipline, freezing dorms, and obsession with toughening boys into men. Charles, by all accounts, hated it. Letters from his time there paint a picture of isolation, bullying, and quiet despair. He described it as Kolditz and kilts, a reference to the infamous German POW camp. But Philip reportedly told him to man up. The phrase may not have been literal, but the sentiment was. Charles's emotions were treated as liabilities. Sensitivity was seen as a defect, and the more he recoiled, the more Philip pushed. Teachers at Gordonstoun noted that Charles didn't rebel. He withdrew. He became more inward, more tentative, and yet Philip remained unmoved. Behind closed doors, their relationship fared no better. Philip was famously sarcastic, often using mockery as a parenting tactic. According to multiple royal biographers, including Jonathan Dimbleby, who wrote with Charles's cooperation, Philip would regularly ridicule Charles in front of others, especially for his shyness or perceived weakness. He believed it would toughen him up. It didn't. One courtier recalled a dinner where Charles tried to contribute a serious thought about environmental issues, only for Philip to interrupt with a dismissive quip about tree hugging. Everyone laughed. Charles didn't, and no one apologized. In many ways, Philip viewed Charles as a project, a future king in need of spine, but Charles viewed himself as a disappointment, someone who could never measure up. Even as an adult, he carried the weight of that dynamic. During their strained conversations, Charles would often defer, even when he disagreed. He rarely confronted his father. He merely endured him. To his credit, Philip did mellow later in life. He spoke more warmly of Charles in his final decades, though the damage was already done. Charles, by then a man in his 60s, was still explaining himself to the press, to the public, and possibly to the ghost of a father who once believed love was best expressed through disapproval. Because when kings in waiting are raised by soldiers, they don't learn to feel. They learn to flinch. And that pattern of royal tempers clashing with royal expectations continued in the next generation. Only this time, the anger wasn't confined to whispers or wounding quips. It erupted in front of cameras and courtrooms. 46. Princess Anne's temper and profanity. Princess Anne, the Queen's only daughter, has always walked a tightrope between royal formality and stony-faced intolerance for nonsense. She's been dubbed the hardest-working royal, praised for her bluntness, and quietly admired for being allergic to PR fluff. But beneath her no-nonsense reputation lies a long-standing, well-circulated rumor that eventually proved impossible to deny. Princess Anne has one hell of a temper, and a mouth to match. Unlike her more image-sensitive siblings, Anne never really cared about cultivating public affection. She wasn't there to smile, wave, and pretend to enjoy small talk with strangers. She was there to do the job, efficiently, and, if necessary, with a little swearing. Over the years, this simmering temperament turned into a running joke among palace staff. But behind the smirks were more serious accounts. Recollections of full-throttle tirades, frostbite-inducing glares, and abrupt dismissals of anyone who annoyed her. Former aides have said Anne could switch from calm to volcanic in seconds. And when she snapped, she didn't mince words. One incident, widely reported in the British tabloids, occurred during a public engagement in the 1980s when a local official misspoke while introducing her. Anne, reportedly furious at being misaddressed, corrected him mid-ceremony, then muttered an expletive under her breath that was unfortunately caught by a nearby microphone. The audio didn't make it to the evening news, but the journalists present never forgot it. Another moment, more well-known, came during an encounter with a persistent paparazzo. Anne, already annoyed by the photographer's intrusion, reportedly turned and shouted, "Why don't you just expletive off?" The incident made headlines, not for its vulgarity, but for how refreshingly honest it seemed. The British public curiously loved it. Anne's profanity wasn't confined to journalists. Staffers have privately admitted that working in her household required nerves of steel. She was known to throw files across rooms, slam doors, and deliver tongue lashings that made senior civil servants wilt. She didn't suffer fools, one former employee said, or anyone else really. But what made her behavior remarkable wasn't just the tone, it was the consistency. She was equally sharp with herself. Anne didn't make excuses. She didn't play victim. She held herself and everyone else to an almost military standard. Raised by Philip and molded by Gordonstown, she inherited all the discipline and none of the diplomacy. Her temper, in hindsight, reads less like rebellion and more like overcorrection. In a family trained to conceal everything, Anne let it rip. And the result was oddly cathartic. For every subject she offended, there were 10 more who found her honesty refreshing. Still, the palace never officially commented. It didn't need to. Anne's reputation preceded her. The Princess Royal became a sort of sanctioned loose cannon, loud, sharp, but useful. As long as the work got done, no one complained too loudly about the swearing. Because when you're the daughter of a queen, a little fury is forgiven, especially if it's well-dressed and on time. And speaking of well-dressed fury, the next Windsor in line carried something far worse than bad manners. He carried entitlement so swollen it became corrosive. 47. Prince Andrew's extreme arrogance toward staff. Among all the Windsor siblings, Prince Andrew seemed the least burdened by introspection. Where Charles brooded, Anne barked, and Edward faded politely into the background, Andrew leaned into his status like it was armor. As the second son, he grew up with all the privilege of proximity to power, and none of the pressure of eventual rule. And it showed. The rumor that Prince Andrew was arrogant with staff downright impossible to work for, and oblivious to the concept of please or thank you, began early. Palace aides whispered that he was demanding, dismissive, and deeply entitled. Over time, those whispers became interviews, then memoirs, then sworn testimony. Andrew's behavior was described by former staff as spoiled child meets minor dictator. He reportedly expected doors to be opened before he reached them, pillows fluffed to exact specifications, and tea served at precisely the right temperature. Otherwise, it was sent back, usually with an eye roll or a passive-aggressive jab. Multiple staffers recounted that Andrew would refer to underlings as the help, or callously ask, "Who are you again?" even after working with someone for months. One butler revealed that Andrew would bark orders at 2 a.m., then complain if service took more than a minute. He treated the royal household not as a professional institution, but as an extension of his whims. And then there was the teddy bear story. One former maid claimed that Andrew kept a collection of plush toys arranged in specific positions on his bed, and that any deviation from this arrangement would result in a tantrum. While this might sound like tabloid folklore, the story was later corroborated by a second palace staffer in a separate interview. It became symbolic. Andrew, the man-child, presiding over a kingdom of cushions and command barked from behind gold-rimmed teacups. Even outside the palace, Andrew's reputation preceded him. Former pilots, security officers, and hotel staff from official overseas tours have all described him as rude, dismissive, and uninterested in basic decorum. During one trip, he allegedly told a hotel manager, "I don't care who you are, just get it done." Another former aide described him as a man who couldn't imagine being told no by anyone who didn't wear a crown. Royal insiders confirmed that staff turnover in Andrew's private office was unusually high. People simply didn't last. Those who did either had remarkable patience or a tolerance for verbal slights. And unlike other royals who mellowed with age, Andrew seemed to double down, his arrogance calcifying into habit. Officially, Buckingham Palace never confirmed the accounts, but they didn't deny them either. And when Andrew's public standing collapsed years later under the weight of a very different scandal, many looked back at the staff rumors not as gossip, but as foreshadowing. Because arrogance left unchecked doesn't just offend people, it sets the stage for bigger, darker falls. And Andrew, as it turns out, wasn't just bad with manners. He was also dangerously close to money he shouldn't have touched. 48. Prince Andrew's financial dependence on shady donors. For most of his adult life, Prince Andrew projected the image of a man who had everything: royal status, military honors, luxury travel, and an endless supply of tailored suits and expensive watches. But behind that veneer of affluence was a more uncomfortable reality, one long whispered by palace insiders, foreign diplomats, and exasperated accountants alike. That Andrew, the so-called Playboy Prince, wasn't nearly as financially independent as he appeared. And worse, that he kept his lifestyle afloat through a network of obscure financiers, wealthy foreign acquaintances, and deals that raised more eyebrows than revenue. At first, this rumor seemed like typical royal gossip. Royals accept gifts. They mingle with elites. What's the harm? But as the details piled up and the donors were named, it became clear this wasn't just about generosity. It was about access, influence, and a man who repeatedly courted people with checkered pasts to fund a lifestyle far beyond what his official income could support. The most damning revelations began surfacing in the 2010s. One of the earliest red flags was Andrew's connection to David Rowland, a financier once described as shy of the spotlight and deeply embedded in offshore banking. In 2010, Andrew was photographed on Rowland's private yacht in the Mediterranean. Not unusual in itself, until it emerged that the Rowland family had quietly helped pay off portions of Sarah Ferguson's debts, and that Andrew had introduced Rowland to key figures in the British business world during his time as the UK's special trade envoy. This blurred line between royal diplomacy and personal favors set off alarm bells. Andrew was supposed to represent the UK's interests abroad, not arrange networking sessions for billionaires with opaque portfolios. Still, nothing technically broke the rules. That was the defense. Until it kept happening. In 2021, an investigation by The Guardian revealed that in 2017, Prince Andrew received a direct payment of £1.5 million from a prominent Bahraini businessman. The money was funneled into his personal account, days after they reportedly met for a private lunch at Buckingham Palace. There was no clear explanation for the payment, no disclosed service or business arrangement, just the usual silence. Around the same time, Andrew was also linked to controversial figures like Tariq Kaitouni, a convicted Libyan gun smuggler who attended Princess Eugenie's wedding at Andrew's invitation. Then there was Timur Kulibayev, a Kazakh oligarch with deep ties to oil wealth and authoritarian politics, from whom Andrew sold his Sunning Hill Park estate at a suspiciously inflated price, far above market value. That sale raised serious questions. Why would a foreign businessman pay millions over asking price for a property he never used? What was he buying, if not real estate? And of course, looming over all this, was the now infamous association with Jeffrey Epstein, a relationship that Andrew initially downplayed as a friendship, only to later admit was a mistake after photos, emails, and travel logs told a different story. That association alone brought years of scrutiny into Andrew's financial and social decisions and led to his eventual stepping back from royal duties in 2019. The picture that emerges is not just one of recklessness, but of dependence. Prince Andrew, despite his public title and ceremonial roles, lacked the financial discipline, or perhaps the humility, to live within his means. So he found others who would foot the bill. Private jets, security details, lavish trips. It was all subsidized by people who wanted proximity to a Windsor and were willing to pay for it. And the monarchy, for a long time, let it happen. Quietly. Uncomfortably. Because acknowledging the problem would mean admitting that one of their own had blurred the lines between royal privilege and private gain. Eventually, the money trail became too long to ignore. And while Andrew may never face criminal charges for his financial choices, the reputational cost has already been exacted. Stripped of his military titles and patronages, he remains a prince in name, but an exile in practice. Because when a royal sells access, what they give away isn't just their own integrity, it's the monarchy's currency of trust. And once that's spent, even the most gilded palace door can't close fast enough on what's coming next. 49. Prince Andrew lying about his whereabouts. By the time Prince Andrew sat down for his now infamous 2019 BBC Newsnight interview, the public already had a feeling that something was off. The allegations circling around him had moved beyond vague rumors or tabloid innuendo. There were documents, dates, photographs. It was no longer about perception. It was about timelines. And yet, what made the interview so catastrophic wasn't just what he said. It was what he claimed not to have done. Because if the royal family had once excelled at evasive silence, Prince Andrew chose a different route, implausible denial. And as it turns out, the rumors about him lying about his whereabouts, completely true. The most memorable moment of that interview, now immortalized in media law lectures and PR disaster handbooks, came when Prince Andrew attempted to explain away a specific accusation by offering a strangely specific alibi, that he could not have been present at a particular location in 2001 because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking with his daughter. It was an answer so oddly detailed and so implausible that it immediately became a cultural reference point. Even people who had never followed royal news knew the punchline, Pizza Express in Woking. But the problem wasn't just that the excuse sounded unlikely, it's that the timelines didn't add up. The claim was made in direct contradiction to travel logs, photographs, and witness accounts that placed Andrew in London and New York at key moments tied to Epstein-related investigations. Documents showed him on transatlantic flights, attending parties, and being in the company of people he later claimed not to know particularly well. One glaring inconsistency emerged around a photograph of Andrew with his arm around a young woman, one of Epstein's accusers, in a London townhouse. Andrew would later claim he had no memory of the photo being taken, and even suggested it might have been doctored. But experts reviewed the image. Forensic analysis confirmed it hadn't been manipulated, and witnesses placed Andrew at the residence on multiple occasions. The no recollection defense quickly fell apart. Behind the scenes, palace staff and advisors reportedly begged Andrew not to do the interview. They warned that going on record, especially with claims that could be fact-checked in real time, would only deepen the crisis. But Andrew insisted. He believed that clearing his name in public, on his terms, would restore his image. It did the opposite. After the interview aired, public trust collapsed. Multiple charities and organizations severed ties with him. The Queen, under mounting pressure, effectively removed him from public duties. And internally, royal aides began leaking stories of frustration. Andrew had ignored advice, misrepresented events, and constructed alibis that couldn't be verified. Some staff even hinted that he'd misled members of the family themselves. Later court documents, media investigations, and interviews with people close to the events confirmed what had long been suspected. Prince Andrew's statements about where he was, and where he wasn't, simply didn't hold up. He had lied, or at the very least distorted the truth beyond recognition. The royal institution, so adept at burying embarrassment, couldn't cover for him this time. The scandal wasn't just about morality or criminality, it was about credibility. When a royal's word is revealed to be unreliable, the damage goes deeper than public image. It corrodes the foundation of inherited trust. And in Andrew's case, his evasions weren't just poor PR. They were symptomatic of a life built on entitlement, where consequences were someone else's problem. What made the lies so glaring was that they weren't even necessary. A simple, "I don't remember" might have sufficed. But Andrew didn't just deny. He created alternate realities. His downfall wasn't just orchestrated by journalists or lawyers. He did much of the heavy lifting himself. Because when your entire defense hinges on a pizza place, and the receipts don't match the story, the question becomes, what else doesn't match? And as the public pieced together his movements, one connection cast the longest shadow of all. The one he could no longer dismiss, downplay, or deny. The one involving a disgraced financier and a friendship that would finally cost him his royal future. 50. Prince Andrew's Epstein connection. For years, the full extent of Prince Andrew's connection to Jeffrey Epstein hovered somewhere between an unspoken embarrassment and a tabloid-feeding frenzy. It was a rumor that began as a quiet hum in diplomatic circles and society gossip columns. A prince consorting with a convicted sex offender, traveling with him, staying in his homes, even inviting him into royal circles. But unlike most royal rumors, this one refused to die. Because the further investigators dug, the more undeniable it became. The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were documents, photographs, flight logs, statements. And by the time the palace finally reacted, the damage was no longer hypothetical. It was historic. The friendship between Prince Andrew and Epstein wasn't a brief social fluke. It was a sustained, documented relationship that spanned at least a decade. They were introduced in the 1990s through Ghislaine Maxwell, a close friend of Andrew's and the daughter of disgraced media tycoon Robert Maxwell. Epstein, then a rising financier with a penchant for surrounding himself with the rich and powerful, welcomed the association. And Andrew, already known for cultivating wealthy connections, seemed equally at ease in Epstein's world. The earliest red flags came in 2000, when Epstein was spotted at several high-profile events with the Duke of York, including a party at the Queen's Sandringham estate. That same year, Andrew attended Maxwell's birthday celebration at Epstein's New York townhouse, one of the locations later central to investigations. By 2001, the now famous photograph of Andrew with Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's accusers, was taken in that very house. Andrew claimed the photo might be fake. Forensic analysts disagreed. In 2008, Epstein was convicted in Florida on charges related to soliciting minors. Most public figures cut ties. Not Andrew. He remained in contact, visiting Epstein in 2010 after his release from prison. That visit, captured by paparazzi, showed Andrew walking in Central Park with Epstein and entering and exiting the financier's Manhattan mansion. It wasn't a private dinner. It was a full-on reappearance. When questioned later about why he visited a convicted sex offender, Andrew replied that he was going to break off the friendship. The public, quite understandably, struggled with the logic of flying across the Atlantic to end a relationship in person, at a man's home. For 4 days, the outrage was immediate. Organizations began to question his patronage. Anti-trafficking charities distanced themselves. The British public, already skeptical of his lavish lifestyle and frequent use of taxpayer resources, had finally run out of patience. And then came the lawsuit. In 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil case against Andrew in the United States, alleging that she had been trafficked to him by Epstein when she was underage. Andrew denied the claims. The palace issued careful, sterile statements. But the U.S. legal system wasn't playing by royal rules. Discovery requests, legal filings, and mounting media pressure left Andrew cornered. In early 2022, just weeks before he was due to face a deposition, Andrew settled the lawsuit out of court for a reported £12 million, a sum he claimed came from personal funds, though speculation remains about whether the Queen contributed privately to avoid a full trial. Importantly, the settlement included no admission of guilt. But, as any courtroom observer knows, money talks. And £12 million doesn't sound like the price of innocence. It sounds like the price of silence. Following the settlement, Buckingham Palace took formal action. Andrew was stripped of his military titles and royal patronages. He was barred from using His Royal Highness in any official capacity. It was the closest thing to a royal defrocking in modern history. The palace wanted the story to end there, quietly, but it didn't. Because Prince Andrew's connection to Epstein wasn't just damaging by association. It was emblematic of something deeper. A royal who saw no risk in consorting with the powerful and the predatory, so long as they provided luxury, privacy, and immunity from scrutiny. In the end, the scandal didn't just stain Andrew. It splashed across the very institution that had shielded him. The monarchy, long skilled at surviving its own dysfunction, found itself bruised by its inability, or unwillingness, to course correct sooner. And so the public was left to ask, how many warnings were ignored? How many introductions brokered? How many moments passed where someone might have said, "This isn't just a rumor anymore"? The answer came too late. But the consequences came all the same. And as Andrew faded from the royal front lines, another story began to emerge. Less scandalous, but just as strange. About a different royal and his very particular approach to toothpaste. 51. King Charles III's valet. Squeezing toothpaste for him. If Prince Andrew's downfall was about devastating scandal, King Charles III's most persistent rumors have always sounded like satire, stranger than fiction, harmless on the surface, but unnerving in what they imply. Perhaps no rumor exemplifies this quite like the one that followed him for decades, murmured by ex-staffers, mocked by comedians, and eye-rolled by palace aides, that Charles didn't squeeze his own toothpaste. That somewhere, in the vast daily machinery of royal life, someone's job, literally, was to lay out the toothbrush and apply exactly 1 inch of paste, pressed with millimetric precision onto the bristles, ready for the royal mouth. It sounded too absurd to be real, a tabloid invention, a Monty Python sketch, and yet, this particular rumor, filed under too specific not to be true, has been confirmed multiple times by people who were actually there. Let's be clear, Charles, then Prince of Wales, didn't just have a valet, he had an entourage. His team was known as the Office, a soft-sounding euphemism for a full-time personal staff that included valets, chefs, typists, dressers, and bodyguards, each assigned to tend to what most people would consider routine human behavior. But the toothpaste story persisted above all others because it captured something bigger. The royal bubble, in full surreal bloom. In 2015, Serving the Royals, Inside the Firm, a documentary featuring ex-palace staffers, aired one of the most talked-about segments on royal excess. Among the former insiders was Paul Burrell, once butler to Princess Diana, who explained in astonishing detail how the prince's daily routine was managed. According to Burrell, Charles's pajamas were pressed every morning, his shoelaces ironed, his bath drawn to a specific temperature, just under tepid. And yes, the toothpaste was pre-squeezed onto the brush, laid out precisely at 8:30 a.m. every day. The toothpaste? Colgate. The length? Exactly 1 inch. Burrell's claims were corroborated by other former palace staff, including Michael Fawcett, Charles's longtime valet and fixer, who became infamous within royal circles for his loyalty and his job description. It was Fawcett who reportedly oversaw the preparation of the bathroom, ensuring that the prince never had to fumble with the tube or misjudge water temperature. Over the years, Fawcett's role ballooned far beyond bathroom duties, but it was the toothpaste image that stuck in the public's mind. Why? Because it wasn't just about convenience. It was about distance. About the immense, unrelatable rituals of royalty that made Charles, for many years, appear as someone both eccentric and disconnected from the world outside his tailored shirts and organic Dutchy biscuits. When asked about the claim in interviews, palace spokespeople never issued formal denials. They didn't have to. The public had already decided it was true, because it felt true. And in a way, that was worse than confirmation. It meant the rumor wasn't surprising. It fit. To his credit, Charles has spent much of his reign attempting to modernize the monarchy, streamline royal operations, and refocus attention on environmental causes, sustainable agriculture, and national unity. Or about the strangeness of royal dependency, and about the unseen labor propping up a life so insulated, even the bristles on a toothbrush became someone else's responsibility. Because if your toothpaste is applied by a valet, what else in your world goes unquestioned? As it turns out, quite a lot, especially when it comes to eggs, very soft ones. Time to the second, or else. 52. Charles III, demanding soft-boiled eggs, cooked to exact seconds. You could fill entire archives with the strange habits of royalty, but King Charles III's breakfast eggs may well deserve their own chapter. For years, this rumor was passed along like a piece of royal folklore, absurd, hilarious, and oddly specific. The future king, it was said, demanded that his soft-boiled eggs be cooked not just to a certain degree of doneness, but to the second. That if even slightly underdone, or worse, slightly overdone, they were immediately rejected. Some versions of the tale claimed that multiple eggs had to be prepared in sequence to ensure at least one met His Royal Highness's exacting standards. Naturally, it sounded like satire, until the former staff confirmed it, in detail. This wasn't just a matter of culinary fussiness. It was a ritual. And in the royal household, rituals are never just rituals. They are code, status, control. The egg story, as it turns out, wasn't about protein. It was about precision. According to multiple accounts from former palace chefs and aides, Charles insisted on having his breakfast eggs boiled for precisely 4 minutes. No more, no less. If the cook even suspected that the water had been removed from the heat a few seconds early or late, a fresh batch would begin. Some chefs took to boiling 6 or 7 eggs in succession, staggered by 10 seconds each, so Charles could tap the tops of each and select the one that yielded just the right amount of give. No runny whites, no dry yolks. Anything in between was failure. Chef Graham Newbould, who previously served the royal family, spoke openly about Charles's breakfast demands, which also included a side of specially sourced bread, teas and honey transported from Highgrove House. Everything had its place. Everything had a rule. One cracked yolk could upend the entire operation. Why eggs? Perhaps because they're deceptively simple. Easy to get wrong. And in royal life, where most things are dictated for you, tours, speeches, photo ops, breakfast might be one of the few remaining arenas where a future king could impose control on his surroundings. This micromanaged meal sparked equal parts amusement and horror among those behind the scenes. Staffers described it as one of the most frustrating tasks in royal service, knowing that the day could begin with royal dissatisfaction over a single bite. But more than that, it symbolized Charles's deep attachment to routine. He wasn't a tyrant. He was a creature of detail, tethered to structure in a world of unpredictable ceremony and inherited responsibility. To be fair, Charles wasn't alone in his culinary quirks. Queen Elizabeth reportedly enjoyed cereal stored in plastic containers and poured her own tea in spite of all the servants. But the public perception of Charles was different, shaped by years of tabloid caricature, a famously troubled first marriage, and a reputation for eccentricity. The egg story fit the character too well to dismiss, and so it stuck. To his critics, It revealed a man too insulated by privilege to see how odd his demands really were. To others, it showed a man craving precision in a life without freedom. Either way, it was true. And even as he transitioned into kingship, the image of Charles tapping boiled eggs while valets arranged toast with rulers refused to die. It became part of his mythos, a man of towering causes and towering demands, often for things that most of us take for granted. But at least eggs are harmless. The same could not be said of the next rumor, one involving letters, lobbying, and a constitutional line that royals were never supposed to cross. 53. Charles III, sending angry letters, Black Spider memos. Long before Charles became king, he was already dubbed the meddling prince, a man with strong opinions and an even stronger fountain pen. For decades, a quiet rumor churned through government offices and private newsrooms that the heir to the throne was secretly lobbying ministers, writing directly to officials, and attempting to influence government policy through personal letters, often written in a hurried, spidery hand. They were dubbed the Black Spider memos, named for Charles's distinctive jagged handwriting. For years, the existence of these letters was denied, mocked, or simply ignored. But they were real. And they weren't just a minor curiosity, they were a constitutional migraine. In Britain's unwritten code of governance, the monarch, and by extension the heir, must remain politically neutral. The crown reigns, but does not interfere. Charles, however, seemed to operate under a different interpretation, one where being the Prince of Wales granted not just privilege, but a peculiar kind of access and influence. The content of the memos remained a mystery until The Guardian launched a lengthy legal campaign in the early 2000s to have them released under the Freedom of Information Act. The government resisted. So did Clarence House. For over a decade, courts, politicians, and the public argued over whether the future king had the right to engage with ministers privately, and whether the public had the right to know. In 2015, after years of stonewalling, the memos were finally released. They revealed Charles had written to multiple departments on topics ranging from agriculture and architecture to military equipment and herbal medicine. His tone was not aggressive, but it was involved. He expressed concern. He offered suggestions. He asked for updates. In one letter, he criticized the lack of equipment for British troops. In another, he lobbied for changes to environmental protections. In yet another, he urged the government to support complementary medicine, an area he's championed for years, often in contrast to scientific consensus. Was he well-intentioned? Absolutely. Was it appropriate? That was the problem. The memos sparked an immediate firestorm. Critics accused Charles of overstepping his role. Defenders claimed he was merely engaging as a concerned citizen. But Charles wasn't just a citizen. He was the future king. And even a well-meaning letter, when written on royal letterhead, carries weight. The scandal didn't derail his path to the throne, but it did solidify his public image, a man who couldn't stop himself from trying to reshape the world, even when protocol demanded silence. Charles later claimed that as king, he understood he must behave differently, that the crown came with restraint. But the letters remain, a paper trail of opinion, persuasion, and perhaps most troubling of all, access. Because when your handwritten note can change a minister's calendar or shift a department's focus, you're no longer just an observer, you're a quiet force. And now that he's king, the fountain pen may be holstered, but its ink still lingers in the margins of a modern monarchy, unsure of where duty ends and influence begins.